21. They are not good people. Lily picked up the stack of books again, then hesitated and set them back down. Actually, I'm looking for material for a potions essay. Professor Slughorn assigned a review on the principles of how Moonstone works in Draught of Peace. He wants at least 3 primary source citations. She stared at the pile in frustration. But I don't know how to organize it. These sources all say more or less the same thing, but not exactly. Regulus glanced at her, aware that young students like her had never had much instruction in academic writing. How do you usually write your essays? He asked. Well, copy what the books say and add my own thoughts, Lily answered uncertainly. Regulus sat and gestured for her to sit as well. Muggle universities have a systematic method for writing papers, he began. At the words Muggle University, Lily's eyes lit up. Regulus continued. First, don't start writing right away. Skim all the materials first. Note every useful point and mark the source. Lily blinked and listened intently. Regulus pulled a blank sheet of parchment from his notebook and tore it into several small slips. For example, write down, the lunar magic of Moonstone can neutralize the restless magic residue of Dreamgrass. See Moonlight and Potions, p. 147. He wrote reference 1 in the corner of one slip. That way you have an independent piece of information. When you have enough notes, start categorizing. Which sources discuss properties, which discuss preparation, and which discuss side effects. Lily's eyes widened. And then? Then find connections between the viewpoints. Regulus flicked his wand and the slips of parchment floated in the air. Say Book A recommends powdering the Moonstone, Book B recommends slicing it, and Book C says to soak it whole. You have to ask why they differ. Is it a different recipe, different schools of thought, or did they use moonstones from different sources? He let the slips arrange and combine overhead. Find the reason for the differences, and your paper will have depth. Finally, use your own logic to link the fragments. Considering factor X, viewpoint A applies best to situation Y, while method B is superior under condition Z. Therefore, the comprehensive suggestion is. Lily was completely absorbed. She pulled out her own parchment and quill and rapidly wrote down the steps. Skim, gather literature, categorize, find connections, tie it together. This is so useful. Can I tell others? My friends are also worrying about their essays. Regulus nodded. You can, but don't say I taught you. Lily paused mid-stroke and looked at him, puzzled. Why? Because I'm a Slytherin and you're a Gryffindor, Regulus said calmly. There are boundaries that don't need to be crossed or flaunted. If your friends ask, just say it's a method you saw at a Muggle university. A Slytherin teaching a Muggle method was a taboo in pure-blood circles, especially now. Regulus trusted Lily to keep the secret. She understood the importance of boundaries. At the same time, it was a test of whether she could keep a promise. After a moment, Lily understood. He was a pure-blood Slytherin and shouldn't be seen to adopt or spread Muggle techniques, however helpful. She nodded vigorously. I understand. Thank you, Black. You're welcome. Lily packed her things and started to go. At the end of the shelf, she looked back. You know, if you were in Gryffindor, we might have been very good friends. Regulus met her earnest expression. His voice was very soft. Friends aren't divided by houses, Miss Evans. Lily smiled, bright as sunlight breaking through clouds. Then, goodbye, Regulus. Goodbye, Lily. The red-haired girl slipped between the stacks. Regulus remained seated. He knew someone would come. 5 minutes later, a cold voice came from the shadows between the shelves. Stay away from her. Severus Snape stepped out, his black robes blending with the darkness. His face was paler than usual, his lips a thin line, suppressed anger swirling in his dark eyes. Regulus stopped what he was doing and looked at him calmly. Snape, is something the matter? I said, stay away from Lily. Snape's voice was low and sharp like a serpent's hiss. Your tricks, I see them clearly, pretending to be gentle, pretending to be different, all to gain trust, and then what? Regulus interrupted. Exploit her? Hurt her? Snape took a step forward, his fingers pressing at his sleeve. His tone was intense. You think you're cleverer than those people? You think I don't know what you're planning? Regulus sighed slightly. Snape, you've been watching, haven't you? Watching Lily talk to me, watching her smile, watching her leave, and then coming out to warn me. He looked straight at him. Do you think this is protecting her? Or is it that you can't stand her showing kindness to anyone but you? Snape's expression went ugly. You. Let me finish. Regulus raised a hand. You're angry not because I might hurt Lily. You know I won't, at least not now. You're angry because Lily chose to talk to me, because she smiled at me, because she seems willing to trust a Slytherin other than you. He leaned back in his chair. You want to be the only one she trusts, don't you? That special, unique person who understands everything about her. Snape's breathing grew heavy. His fingers trembled slightly. Regulus had hit the mark. He shook his head and his voice turned colder. Today she talks to me. Tomorrow she might be doing potions experiments with James Potter. At the mention of Potter, Snape's pupils contracted and his hand almost closed on his wand. See, Regulus said, just the name and you lose control. I'll give you one piece of advice, Snape. If you truly care about Lily, don't try to control who she befriends or who she talks to. That will only push her away. Let her choose to stay by her own will, not because you've driven away everyone else. Snape remained where he was, tense beneath his robes. After a few seconds, he spat. What would you know? How could a pure-blood young master like you possibly understand? I understand more than you imagine. Regulus cut him off, looking straight into Snape's eyes. I understand the arrogance of pure-blood families, the struggles of half-bloods, and the isolation of Muggleborns. None of that justifies behaving like this. He stood and walked past Snape. Warning me? He said no more, picked up astral meditation, and walked toward Madame Pince's desk, leaving Snape to the shadows. Regulus thought that Snape was a walking contradiction, stunningly talented, yet trapped by inferiority and possessiveness, craving power and flirting with darkness. In the original story, Snape didn't truly wake up until he lost Lily, and by then it was too late. He might not heed these words now. If he was wise, he might begin to reflect. If not, at least he knew Regulus was not his enemy. Ironically, Snape's obsession with Lily was his greatest weakness. Lord Voldemort and even Dumbledore would exploit it in time. Perhaps, when everyone else fed his paranoia, someone who didn't would profit in unexpected ways. And speaking of Snape, there was James Potter. In Regulus's view, this official suitor for Lily was an expendable minor character, a school bully who would later be painted as a hero because he had a change of heart. Could someone who had once done harm be celebrated simply because he later chose the right side? This world could be cruelly ironic. The line between good and evil, hero and villain, often depended on which side you stood on in the end, rather than what you'd done before. Snape wasn't a good person, and Potter less so. From certain angles, Potter was worse. Regulus put the thought aside. Madame Pince inspected the book. Astral meditation, obscure, loan period 2 weeks. That's fine. Regulus signed for it. When he left the library, the torches in the castle corridors were already lit, their flickering light throwing long shadows across the stone. 22. Starry Sky Meditation. In mid-September, the morning mist of the Scottish Highlands still clung to the grounds, and the history of magic classroom on the 3rd floor of the castle was full of drowsy first years. When Professor Binns drifted into the room, almost no one looked up. The oldest teacher at Hogwarts began the lesson in his unchanging, dry tone. Today we shall continue our discussion of the Goblin Rebellion of 1612, which began in the Three Broomsticks in Hogsmeade when the Goblin leader. Regulus watched the professor more than the lecture. Binns was translucent. When sunlight passed through him, it left a faint shadow on the podium floor. What troubled Regulus were the oddities in Binns's magic. Other professors' magic felt like flowing fire, exuberant life, or deep lake water. Binns's magic was almost absent, or more precisely, almost imperceptible. Regulus closed his eyes and focused his magical senses on the podium. A living wizard's magic was usually like ripples on a pond, with a clear center and edges. Binns's was like a thin mist, uniform, delicate, stable, without fluctuation or core, almost merging with the surrounding air. He'd read as a child that the soul was the source of magic. So a ghost, a remnant of a soul, must have some form of magic sustaining its existence. If a wizard's body disappears and the soul remains, what becomes of the magic? Does it attach itself to the soul instead? If Binns's magic had this misty form, what did that say about the difference between an intact soul and a remnant one? Was Voldemort's pursuit of immortality merely an attempt to bypass the physical death soul remnant process by splitting the soul? Regulus didn't have enough knowledge to draw a conclusion. When the bell rang, Binns reached the point where the rebellion was eventually suppressed by the Ministry of Magic, and without saying class dismissed, he drifted straight through the wall, leaving most of the students still half asleep. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the eastern end of the library was sunlit. Madame Pince moved her patrol silently between the stacks. Regulus intended to check the perimeter of the restricted section. Hogwarts rules forbade first-years from borrowing restricted section books or even entering that area, but the shelves weren't completely enclosed. From a distance, you could still make out some spines. Madame Pince made a full circuit every 30 minutes, lingering a little longer whenever she passed the restricted section. Regulus timed her rounds and moved toward the back, holding a copy of The Evolution of Medieval Magical Law as if he'd been browsing. His eyes skimmed the rows until they paused at a thick leather volume with frayed edges. The spine was mottled but legible, a brief history of soul magic. Regulus reached out with magic, no wand work, just raw sensory threading, and tried to probe the book. He stretched a fine filament of magic toward the restricted section, but the moment it crossed the threshold, it was scattered by a majestic, heavy magic that felt almost brutal. He was about to try again when a cold voice came from behind him. "Mr. Black." Regulus snapped his magic back and turned. "Madame Pince." "You have been standing in front of the restricted section for a minute." Her eyes were sharp as knives. "First years are forbidden from approaching it. You know the rules." "Yes, madam." He lifted the book he'd been holding. "I was just looking for reference material. Passing by, I was surprised by the number of books back there. Hogwarts has an incredible collection." His tone was earnest, his expression full of scholarly hunger. Pince's face softened a fraction, but her gaze stayed wary. "The books in the restricted section are sealed for a reason. Much of that knowledge is unsuitable for young wizards. Go back to your seat." "Of course, madam." Regulus bowed and turned toward the potions shelf, inwardly thinking, "I need that book." The library gradually filled, and Regulus packed up to return to the Slytherin common room to finish his potions essay. At 11 o'clock that night, the Slytherin dormitory was quiet. Avery slept with steady breathing. A faint light glowed inside Alex's bed curtains, likely he was reviewing charms for the next day. Hermes's curtains were tightly drawn. There was no sound, but Regulus suspected Hermes wasn't asleep. Regulus closed his own dark green curtains, cast a silencing charm, sat cross-legged, and closed his eyes. He opened Starry Sky Meditation to Chapter 3. The book declared that T7 was king of the winter sky, and that the alignment of its 3 belt stars contained balance and power. The meditator was supposed to locate in the night sky, touch those 3 stars with magic, feel their starlight pulse, and then synchronize their personal magic circulation with the constellation's rhythm. A typical wizardly metaphysical exercise, Regulus thought. He had tried it 3 times and failed every time. He had followed the steps exactly, perceive the star field, locate the constellation, extend magic tendrils, but he felt nothing. There was no starlight pulse to sense. Constellations are visual projections of distant stars, not physical constructs. How could they have a pulse? Perhaps the original author had some rare talent for perception that Regulus lacked. He decided instead to substitute the book's mystical assumptions with tools he did possess: an adult scientific mind, a working knowledge of astrophysics, a sensitivity to geometry, precise microcontrol of magic, and a habit of running calculations like a supercomputer. He would build the constellation rather than try to feel one. He abandoned attempting to see the real sky. The dormitory windows were nowhere near good enough anyway, and used magic to construct a model in his mind. Magic flowed into his consciousness, outlining the first point. 2. The red supergiant on 27's right shoulder. Then wriggle, Bellatrix, point by point lit in the dark space of his mind. Using the star map data he had memorized, Regulus formed a 3-dimensional model with correct relative positions and brightness ratios. Holding 12 points of light precisely in place was mentally taxing. It required constant, fine-grained expenditure of magic and energy, but he kept it steady. Next, he connected the points, tracing the image of 27. Magic condensed into thin threads, from 22 to Bellatrix to form the right arm, from Rigel to Scythe for the left, the three belt stars linked by three parallel strands. A glowing 27 took shape in his head with accurate proportions and clean lines. Now for the key step, synchronization. The book had advised letting one's magic follow the constellation's pulse. Regulus had no pulse to follow, but he did have a model. He visualized his own magic circulation as a flowing river and then embedded his mental model of 27 into that riverbed, making the constellation's geometry part of the channel. When the magic flowed through 22, he adjusted the speed. When it reached the three belt stars, he split the flow into three parallel streams. When it traversed the whole figure, it circulated along the outer contours. At first, the magic resisted. The imposed structure felt stiff, and the points flickered. Regulus lowered the flow rate to smooth the current. He refined the model. The three belt stars shouldn't be perfectly collinear, so he added a subtle curve. 22 was 1.3 times brighter than Rigel, so he increased the relative gravity of that node and let more of the flow compress through it. He kept making micro-adjustments, and gradually the resistance eased. The magic began to adapt, the forced channel settling into something like a natural bed. It felt as if a stream had found a new course, man-made but smooth. 1 cycle, 2 cycles, 3 cycles. Regulus opened his eyes and let out a soft breath. The circulation speed hadn't increased much, but it had stabilized into steady, even ripples. With the slightest thought, he unfurled an invisible, weighty barrier that expanded over his whole body, then let it dissipate after a minute. He felt the difference. His overall magic consumption was about the same, but his recovery rate had improved. The change was small but real. He allowed himself a quiet, private smile. It had worked. 23. Herbalism class. On the third Thursday of late September, morning dew condensed into fine droplets on the greenhouse glass. First-year herbology was being held in Greenhouse 3, where the relatively safe magical plants were kept. Safe, that is, provided they were handled correctly. Today, we are going to learn how to handle bubotubers. Professor Sprout stood before a row of clay pots, wearing thick gardening gloves. Her round face glowed red in the warm steam of the greenhouse. Who can tell me the uses of bubotuber pus? A Hufflepuff boy raised his hand immediately. It's used to treat stubborn acne, Professor, but it must be highly diluted, otherwise it causes even more severe ulceration. Exactly right. 5 points to Hufflepuff, Sprout nodded. Now in pairs. Each pair will be given a bubotuber, a pair of gloves, and a glass bottle. Your task is to safely squeeze out the pus and collect it in the bottle. Be careful not to splash it on your skin or robes. Regulus was paired with Avery Cuthbert. Avery wrinkled his nose as he took the clay pot. This thing is really ugly. Bubotubers were indeed unpleasant to look at. Blackish-brown, bulbous rhizomes covered in lumps, each lump topped with tiny holes that oozed a thick, yellowish-green liquid. Put on your gloves, Regulus reminded him, having already nimbly pulled his own on. He picked up the tuber and concentrated his magical sense to examine it. Matter carries magic, he knew that. Some plants' magic is concentrated at their tips, and moonlight grass's magic strengthens under the moonlight, but bubotubers... His perception seeped in. The first thing he felt was life. All plants had a gentle, steady flow of magic, like a slow heartbeat, but mixed into the bubotuber's life flow was something else. His magical sense reported a stinging agitation. The plant's overall aura was stable, but the magic around those lumps was disordered. The pus itself emitted even stronger chaotic fluctuations, blended with a kind of feeling, pain. The thought surfaced in his mind. It wasn't a complex human pain, more a primitive, instinctive discomfort, like the stress response of an injured organism imprinted in its magical signature. What are you dazing off for? Avery had already squeezed out half a bottle of pus. The yellowish-green liquid flowed slowly into the glass. Hurry up! This smell is disgusting. Regulus nodded and pinched a large lump between thumb and forefinger, applying gentle pressure. Squelch! The thick pus flowed out and fell into the bottle. In that instant, Regulus noticed a change. The chaotic magic around the lump weakened, but the plant's pain fluctuations briefly intensified before slowly subsiding. Like popping a pimple, the discomfort rose briefly and then eased. He squeezed 3 lumps in succession, sensing the same pattern each time. On the 4th, he looked up at Professor Sprout as she made her rounds. "Professor," Sprout came over. "What is it, Mr. Black?" "The bubotubers," Regulus asked, somewhat hesitantly. "When they secrete pus, are they experiencing some kind of discomfort? From a magical perspective, the secretion seems accompanied by a pain response." Regulus had always been prone to odd questions. To most first years, his inquiries were barely comprehensible, but they had a habit of hitting the mark with the professors. His reputation had grown. The other students glanced toward him, some halting in their own work. Avery's expression was a complicated mix of bewilderment and mild irritation. He never quite knew if Regulus had read the idea in a book or invented it himself. What irritated him most was that Regulus's questions almost always had purpose. The few Hufflepuffs nearby exchanged looks of genuine curiosity. Discomfort? Pain? Do plants feel anything? Professor Sprout's eyes widened. "You noticed?" "Yes, Professor." Regulus inclined his head politely. "The magical signature in the pus is very chaotic, and the tuber's overall magic fluctuates when squeezed, similar to the magical reaction of an animal when it's injured." Sprout stared for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Few first years can perceive that. Most students only see bubotubers as a source of raw materials. She turned to the class. "Mr. Black has raised an interesting point. In fact, many magical plants do have simple emotions. Bubotuber pus is essentially a defense mechanism, and producing it is a burden on the plant. So when collecting, we should be as gentle as possible to minimize their pain." She demonstrated a gentler technique, applying pressure slowly with the pads of her fingers instead of pinching roughly. "A merciful collector will obtain purer materials," Sprout said. "This is the first lesson of herbology, and one many forget. 10 points to Slytherin for such meticulous observation." Avery leaned toward Regulus and whispered, "How did you feel that? I just thought it was gross." "Concentration, reading, and a bit of talent," Regulus replied simply, and continued handling the remaining lumps. Inwardly, he thought, plants can have emotions, even if primitive. What does that imply? If feelings can be imprinted in magical energy, could magic carry more complex states, toward harm or toward healing? As the lesson reached its second half, the students began cleaning their tools. Regulus washed his bottle, removed his gloves, and walked over to where Professor Sprout was organizing the benches. "Professor, I have another question." "Go ahead, child." "It's about mandrakes," Regulus said. "I read that a mature mandrake's cry is fatal to humans. Is that lethality aimed at the body or the mind?" Sprout stopped and turned, her expression becoming serious. "That's an advanced question. We don't usually go into mandrakes in detail until the upper years." "I know, Professor, but I'm curious." Regulus kept his tone polite but steady. If simply covering one's ears prevents death, the danger must come from hearing the sound. Does the sound itself carry some kind of magic, or does it trigger a reaction within the listener? Sprout gestured toward a small rest area in the corner of the greenhouse and led him to a wicker chair. After they sat, she answered, "It's both." A mandrake's cry contains a powerful surge of magical energy that causes mental shock, directly disturbing the listener's spiritual balance and collapsing consciousness. That's death on a mental level. At the same time, a violent mental collapse triggers a physical chain reaction, cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, and magical instability. So the ultimate death is a dual collapse of both body and mind. Regulus nodded, absorbing the explanation. And the protective earmuffs, do they completely block the sound, or do they weaken the transmission of that magical energy? Good question. Sprout's appreciation showed. Standard protective earmuffs are charm-worked with a sound filtering enchantment. It filters out the specific magical components, the lethal factors of the mandrake's cry. Technically, you can still hear it, but what reaches your ears is a harmless, purified version. Regulus's mind raced. So the lethality is carried by the magic within the sound. Then Sprout's face turned serious. "Child, where are you going with that?" "I was thinking about the possibility of treatment." Regulus chose his words carefully. It was not entirely a lie. If a certain pattern of magical energy can destroy, could a similar pattern, adjusted or reversed, be used to repair? For instance, could we use a related but inverted magical signature to heal mental trauma? 24. natural magic and mandrake. This is an extremely dangerous field, Professor Sprout said slowly. Sonic magic, especially when it operates on the mental level, sits in a high-level, complex borderland between the dark arts and other, less understood branches of magic. Historically, there have been wizards who researched it, but most experiments ended in tragedy. Because it's difficult to control? Regulus asked. Because sound is intangible and diffuse, Sprout explained. You can precisely control the trajectory of a spell, but it's very hard to control how sound propagates. Besides, every soul has subtle differences. A treatment that helps you could be deadly to someone else. There is no universal solution. Regulus thought to himself, sound can be focused. Physical means can do it. There's no reason it couldn't be done magically. No universal cure, but what if there were a way to detect an individual's soul? What if the melody could be tailored and adjusted? Most importantly, healing varies between people, but what about killing? It could be used on a large scale. Another question, Professor. If a mandrake's cry is so dangerous, why isn't it affected itself? Or how do mandrakes communicate with one another? Sprout smiled. You're already asking questions at a newt level. The short answer is mandrakes have their own immunity. Their hearing is different from a wizard's. As for communication, we don't even know if they need it. At the very least, no one has successfully translated mandrake speech, if anyone ever truly wanted to try. She stood and brushed soil from her robes. Keep your curiosity, Mr. Black, but don't try anything reckless until you have enough knowledge and protection. I understand, Professor. Thank you. Regulus stood as well, ideas flashing through his mind. Large-scale killing, targeted killing, mental damage, physical damage, and if there was time, mental healing as another avenue. The class bell rang, and students filed out of the greenhouse. Regulus deliberately lingered, packing slowly until the others were a good distance away. As he turned, Professor Sprout called him back. Mr. Black, could you stay a little longer? Of course, Professor. They stepped out onto the gravel path beside the castle. The September wind still carried warmth. The Black Lake rippled with fine waves in the distance. Your magical perception is quite unusual, Sprout said directly. Most wizards perceive magic much like color. They know it exists, can judge its strength, but struggle with detail. For me, magical perception is like an extra sense, Regulus answered cautiously. I can sense the emotions in a boobatuber's pus, or rather, it's like a feeling. He chose to be partly honest. Sprout was the Hufflepuff head of house, kind and fair, and she knew plants. She deserved a certain trust. And in terms of magical perception, he was exceptional but not unique. Sprout glanced toward the greenhouse. In the innermost part of the second greenhouse, there's a humping willow sapling. I planted it 30 years ago when I was going through a difficult time. That willow is still more irritable and aggressive than most. I've always suspected my emotions affected it. She sighed, her tone serious. So here's my advice. Stay sensitive, but don't go too deep into dark plant work. Some plants, devil's snare, venomous tentacula, and especially varieties bred with dark magic, accumulate pain, anger, and despair that can lash back at anyone who senses them. She looked him in the eye. Your talent is a gift, but it can be a curse. If you encounter something too dark when perceiving, cut the connection immediately and come find me, or another professor. Don't face it alone. I will remember, Professor. Regulus nodded. He felt the warning was sincere. Perhaps she had seen similar cases, maybe even tragedies. Sprout's expression softened. If you're interested in plant magic research, you can apply to be my assistant after your owls. For now, though, build a solid foundation. Every bit of textbook knowledge will be useful. I will, Professor. Now go. Don't be late for your next class. That evening, during the free hour before dinner, Regulus took a detour to a small west side garden. It was planted with ordinary ornamental flowers, no magical specimens, and was usually empty. He wanted to test an idea. Daisies were often used by wizards as basic potion ingredients. He found two growing side by side. One was healthy and plump. The other had the outer three petals yellowed, probably from pests or nutrient deficiency. He crouched, putting his right hand on the soil at the root of the healthy daisy and his left on the root of the damaged one. He closed his eyes and extended his magical perception. The healthy daisy's magic felt warm and steady, a soft golden glow like a slowly rotating halo. The damaged daisy's energy was much dimmer, flickering. In the yellowed petal area, it was almost stagnant. Regulus wanted to try guiding the healthy plant's magic to repair the damaged one. This wasn't a conventional healing charm, which forces repair using a wizard's magic. He intended to act as an intermediary, allowing magic to flow naturally between the two plants. He extended two fine strands of his magic, one to the core of the healthy daisy, the other to the injured area. The threads were extremely thin so as not to disturb the plant's own magic circulation. On the healthy daisy's end, he created a slight high-pressure field, and on the damaged daisy's end, a low-pressure field. Like water flowing downhill, magic should have streamed from healthy to injured. At first, nothing happened. The plant's energies remained separate, ignoring the pressure difference. Regulus adjusted his approach. He remembered the Bubatuber pus emotional expression. Simple pressure might not be enough. Perhaps he needed a form of communication closer to the plant's instincts. He altered his magical output, trying to mimic the healthy daisy's subtle fluctuations. After 5 minutes, a change came. A faint golden filament flowed from the healthy daisy along Regulus's channel, moving very slowly. It reached the damaged petal and seeped in. Regulus watched as the magic within the petal began to recover. Previously stagnant nodes reanimated and started to circulate, slowly at first. The method worked, but with terrible inefficiency. 10 minutes had passed, and he had only guided about a tenth of the repair needed for a single petal, while his own magical expenditure was considerable. He persisted another 5 minutes, then carefully severed the link and withdrew his magic. A fingernail-wide circle of the yellowed edge on the outermost petal had turned fresh green. That was all. The other petals were unchanged. Regulus rubbed his temples. The cost in magic had been surprisingly high, probably not worth it as a practical way to heal common garden plants, but the idea was vindicated. He had confirmed a key hypothesis. Plant magic can be transferred between individuals. More broadly, natural magic, even in apparently passive life forms, can be guided, borrowed, or harnessed by a wizard's will. Mandrakes flashed into his thoughts. If the gentle life magic in ordinary daisies could be guided, then surely magical plants like mandrakes, whose cries contain lethal energy, might be manipulated the same way. The difference was one of nature. One magic nourishes, the other destroys. Mandrakes channel their deadly power through crying, an innate expression rooted in their biology. To bypass the cry and directly access or redirect that source magic might require mapping the flow of energy inside the plant, finding the convergence nodes or trajectories. Perhaps it would be wise to begin by studying mandrake seedlings, watching how their magic changes as they grow. He formed the idea in his mind and named it, almost to himself, a reverse conjecture on mandrake lethality based on plant magic guiding capability. The cry's lethality comes from containing powerful destructive magic that targets both soul and body. That magic is, at root, the same kind of life magic daisies possess, or the chaotic magic in Bubatuber pus, only far more dangerous. If plant magic can be guided and transferred, then theoretically mandrakes could be guided too. Understanding their internal magic map might make it possible to intercept or even reroute their cries. Regulus straightened and walked back toward the castle, the ripples on the lake reflecting the last light of evening, and his mind already racing with plans for how to test the conjecture further. By the time he left the small garden, the sky had already darkened. Lights began to flicker on in the castle windows one after another. Dinner time was approaching. Regulus quickened his pace, only to find someone crouched at the entrance to the greenhouse beds. A Hufflepuff girl, no older than second or third year, her light brown hair tied in a loose bun, was carefully loosening the soil around a potted plant with wilting leaves. "You'll damage the lateral roots doing it that way," Regulus said reflexively, stopping. The girl looked up, blinking. "What?" "The angle of your trowel is too vertical." He pointed to the small iron tool in her hand. "The root system spreads out horizontally, not deep. Digging straight down will cut the lateral roots." She stared at the pot, realization dawning. "No wonder this one hasn't been growing well. Thank you." She adjusted the trowel, slipping it in at a diagonal and gently loosening the earth. "Are you a Slytherin first year?" she asked as she worked. It's rare to see a Slytherin who knows so much about herbology. Regulus Black, first year. He gave his name simply. Eleanor Bones, third year. She smiled, showing a small snaggletooth. The Bones family, you should know us. He did know them. The Bones were one of the sacred 28, comparatively moderate and well represented in the ministry. This Eleanor, he guessed, was likely related to Amelia Bones. Her tone was openly curious. Before you started school, a lot of people, well, a lot of families, wondered whether you'd go into Slytherin like the Blacks always do, or choose Gryffindor like your brother. Regulus raised an eyebrow. He had expected eyes on his sorting. Sirius's choice had been more than rebellion. It had broken 500 years of expectation that a Black belonged in Slytherin. That fact made his own sorting a kind of signal to the rest of the wizarding world. He met Eleanor's gaze evenly. The answer is Slytherin. The speculation can stop now. Eleanor laughed. Indeed, and you seem to be settling in well. He didn't push the topic. He pointed to the pot. Healing herbs like loose soil, but they don't like being moved often. Add a layer of broken ceramic at the bottom for drainage. This pot's holding too much water. The roots will rot if you leave it like this. How can you tell it's holding too much water? She asked, surprised. The leaf edges are curling and the green is too dark, signs of poor root respiration. When you were loosening the soil, it clumped, which means it has too high a moisture content. Merlin, you're right. Eleanor stood and brushed dirt from her hands. I've been using the standard potting mix, but maybe this batch of leaf mold was rotten. Thank you, Mr. Black. They spent a few more minutes trading tips as the light faded. Eleanor showed him how to judge soil density with a fingertip and gave cultivation pointers for a few uncommon plants. Regulus, in turn, taught a couple of simple soil testing charms he'd learned in his lessons. When she packed up her tools, she looked at him. Time to head to the Great Hall. Walk together? Sure. They walked side by side toward the castle. A few Hufflepuffs glanced, surprised to see Eleanor with a Slytherin, but no one spoke. At the entrance to the Great Hall, she waved. See you, Mr. Black. Goodbye, Miss Bones. Regulus moved toward the Slytherin table. As he sat down, Avery leaned over. What were you talking about with the Bones girl? Herbology, Regulus said, beginning to serve himself some roast meat. The greenhouse work had taken more out of him than he'd expected. The Bones family are all right, not terrible. Avery considered that. Amelia in their family is a bit much at the ministry, he said. My father doesn't like her. Maybe she doesn't like Mr. Cuthbert either, Regulus murmured. Avery shrugged. Maybe. Just past midnight, Regulus snapped awake from his meditation. There had been a fluctuation in the castle's ambient magic, sharp, unexpected. His training took over. He drew his magic back into himself, slowed his breathing until his body was still, eyes barely opened slits. Across the dormitory, the bed curtains of Hermes Mulciber were gently parted, and a hooded figure slipped out, silent on the floor. Hermes stood for a moment in the dark as if to make sure of something, then walked the length of the room, pausing at each bed, stopping briefly at Regulus's. A minute later, he left the dormitory. Regulus waited 3 minutes before sitting up. He went to Hermes's bed. The curtains were left slightly ajar. He didn't touch anything. He just scanned the space with his magic sense. The bed was neat. Under the pillow lay a small, dark red leather book with no title, warded against intrusion. Any forced probe would set off an alarm. On the nightstand was an empty glass bottle with a tiny residue of an unfamiliar liquid at the bottom. It wasn't an ordinary potion. Hermes's school bag was on the windowsill, the zipper half open, a corner of parchment sticking out without any protective charms. Regulus used a gentle probe to ease the flap and found a hand-drawn map inside, rough lines, clear labels. Hogwarts dominated the center. Several locations were circled. Corridor on the right side of the 4th floor. Explored, no findings. Abandoned classroom area in the west dungeons. Protected, needs breaking. Room beneath the astronomy tower. Suspected entrance, to be verified. Room beneath the astronomy tower. That should be the castle's outer wall. There shouldn't be chambers there unless it was a secret room or passage. Regulus withdrew his probe and went back to his bed, letting the details settle. What was Hermes Mulciber searching for? And more importantly, for whom? An hour later, at 1:14 a.m., the door opened again and Hermes returned. His footsteps sounded heavier than before. The hem of his robes bore fresh scorch marks. A thin red scratch marred the back of his left hand. He paused in the doorway, eyes sweeping the 3 beds as if to confirm nothing had changed, then moved to his own. As he peeled off his outer robe, Regulus caught a faint sulfur tang, residue of magical fire or some alchemical reaction. Hermes pulled his curtains shut, the rustle of clothes changing, then silence. First year, 11 years old, and already nose-deep in dangerous secrets. Regulus thought of the Mulciber family, one of the sacred 28, but a name that dwelt on the fringes. For generations, they trafficked in rare magical items, intermediaries in the smuggling and collection of dark arts artifacts, skilled at walking the law's edge and secretly connected to shops in Nocturne Alley. They did not publicly rally behind the Dark Lord, but privately supplied certain clients. Was Hermes acting from personal curiosity or carrying out a family task? If the latter, whatever he sought could be connected to the rising threat. An owl hooted distantly outside the window. Regulus did not dwell on it. He resolved to keep watch. He closed his eyes and began a new cycle of magical circulation, the geometric pattern of Orion forming in his mind as starlight-like energy flowed along the calculated trajectories, each thread tuned to listen for the next disturbance. 26. Foundation Thursday night's astronomy class took place atop the astronomy tower, the highest point of the castle. The late September sky was clear and the highland air was cold and sharp. Tonight, we shall learn to locate the dominant ruler of the night, Sirius, Professor Aurora Sinistra said, her voice as soft as a night breeze. An elderly witch, her silver hair was pinned neatly behind her head, and her robes were embroidered with tiny constellations that seemed to carry starlight as she moved. Sirius is not only the brightest star in the night sky. In a magical sense, it has long been regarded as a symbol of guidance and loyalty. The alignment of many ancient seafaring spells and long-distance communication relies on its observation. Students worked in pairs, operating telescopes on brass stands. Regulus was paired with Alex Rosia. Avery had loudly professed zero interest in staring at points of light all night and had settled in a corner with a few other Slytherins, yawning. "First, level the base," Regulus whispered, guiding the somewhat fumbling Alex. "Keep the bubble centered, then release the vertical lock and point the tube to the southeast, about 20 degrees up." Alex followed his instructions and peered through the eyepiece. "It's all blurry. That's because you haven't focused it." Regulus reached out and turned the knob on the tube gently. Slowly, look for a very bright star with a blue-white tint. After a moment, Alex let out a soft cry. "I see it. It's so bright, like a blue-white gemstone. It's beautiful." "That is Sirius." Regulus leaned over to his own scope and finished the calibration with practiced hands. Through the magically enhanced telescope, the star resolved into a brilliant point surrounded by an extremely thin halo that pulsed like a steady breath, a sight a Muggle instrument could never reveal. Though there was no empirical proof, wizards attributed such halos to the star's magical glow. "Very good, Mr. Rosier." Professor Sinistra drifted over. "Now, record its position on your star chart and pay attention to its magnitude." After she'd moved on, Alex whispered, "How are you so good at this? It's like you've used a telescope your whole life." "We have a similar one at home," Regulus answered. The Black family did own an antique astronomical telescope, though he had seldom used it. Alex continued muttering as he clumsily logged coordinates. "So what's the point of astronomy anyway, aside from the stars being pretty? It's more useful than you think." Regulus kept one eye on Sirius, thinking of the passages he'd read in his family's books. Many advanced potions require ingredients harvested under precise lunar phases and stellar positions. For instance, key components for certain batches of Felix Felicis must be gathered according to specific astral alignments. Some branches of ancient runes show fluctuations in power depending on constellations. He added, and many ancient magical contracts, family rituals, even the castle's protective wards, their strength is tied to the cycles of the stars. Understanding the heavens is, in a way, learning the hidden clockwork of the wizarding world. Alex listened, a little stunned. "None of that's in our textbooks." "Because it's material for higher years," Regulus said flatly, "or part of particular family lore." Professor Sinistra clapped her hands and drew the class's attention. Shift your telescopes about 15 degrees to the left and lower the elevation by 5 degrees. You will see 3 bright stars almost equally spaced. That is Orion's belt. Record their positions and relative angles. Regulus followed her instructions. When the 3 stars entered his field of view, his hands paused. It wasn't only their beauty, but the particular alignment that arrested him. Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka. In Muggle astronomy, they were simply 3 stars hundreds of light years away, unrelated except by our line of sight. Through the enchanted telescope, however, something else showed itself. Though separated by vast distances, the faint magical halos of the 3 were not wholly independent. Almost imperceptible, spider silk filaments of magical flow ran between them, forming a very thin triangle of energy. He quickly recorded the coordinates on his star chart, connecting them with dashed lines and noting the angles. Orion's belt was nearly a perfect straight line, but there was a negligible arc. Insignificant on an astronomical scale, yet potentially important for practical magic. Regulus could assemble precise geometric models of constellations in his head, simulate stellar positions, and even project orbital trajectories. Instinctively, he calculated the relative shifts of the 3 a century ahead based on current positions and known proper motions. Stars moved, albeit slowly. Each of the belt stars had its own direction and speed through the galaxy. If motion affected their magical properties, then precise calculation mattered. He decided then to incorporate actual stellar motions into his contemplations, insisting on absolute accuracy. For a moment his thoughts ran ahead of the class until Professor Sinistra's voice brought him back. I see many of you have finished. Remember, the significance of astronomy lies not in memorizing constellation names, but in understanding the eternal rhythm within the movement of the stars. Class dismissed. Eternal rhythm. The phrase echoed in Regulus's mind as he packed away his star chart. Later that night, the dormitory was quiet. He sat cross-legged on his 4-poster bed, curtains drawn, a silencing charm in place. Closing his eyes, he sank inward. He began his magical circulation practice and his starry sky meditation at the same time. Inside him, the flow of magic moved like a gentle stream, cycling along familiar channels and nourishing every part of his body. This was the tempering of flesh, the foundation of foundations. At the highest level of his mind, he constructed a model of Orion's belt, factoring in the subtle offsets he'd observed, the trajectories he'd calculated, and the slow motion of the stars themselves. He gave those 3 points an extremely slow but definite directional drift in his mind, a static framework with a dynamic trend. He then tried to make the rhythm of his inner magical circulation match that dynamic trend. It did not go smoothly at first. The circulation in his body was concrete and perceptible. The movement of stars was an abstract, almost immobile tendency. They seemed to exist on different planes. Regulus was patient. He focused all his mental energy on the dynamic model, feeling the nearly non-existent but real kinetic tension. He made tiny adjustments to the speed of his internal circulation, shifting the whole tone of his cycle, slower, more solemn, more constant. Time passed in silence, 10, 20, 30 minutes. Then something aligned. It was not that the flow of magic drew literal constellation patterns inside him. Rather, on a deeper level, his internal circulation and the essence of the stellar model found a harmonious resonance. In that instant, 2 distinct improvements occurred. First, the normally gentle, nourishing flow of magic took on a firmer, heavier quality. Wherever it moved, it no longer merely refreshed but consolidated. It seemed to reinforce his muscle fibers and bone density more effectively. A new, grounded power rose from the depths of his limbs and bones. Second, the effort of maintaining the dynamic model had been an exercise in extreme focus. The moment of true synchronization anchored his consciousness, his mind cleared and steadied. The clutter of everyday thoughts, the omnipresent messy whisperings of ambient magic in the atmosphere, and even the acute, isolating sense of being a transmigrator in a foreign life were smoothed by a grand, tranquil image. It was as if his soul had found a solid pedestal, calmer and harder to unsettle. This was a qualitative change. Regulus stayed in that state, noting every subtle shift. As the magical flow circulated in synchrony, recovery quickened, and the flow itself seemed more condensed and disciplined. He realized he had stumbled onto a deeper principle. Body, mind, and the flow of magic were not separate. They could be integrated to promote and elevate one another. He named the method in his head, Star Trek Guided Meditation. From then on, physical tempering and mental meditation would no longer be separate practices, but a single exercise in syncing the whole self. With that, the foundation was complete. 27. Slytherin Welcome Party. On the last day of September, just after dinner, the 7th year's Lucretius Boak and Narcissa Black stood at the end of the Slytherin table, tapping their goblets with silver spoons. All Slytherin students, please return directly to the common room after dinner, Narcissa announced, rising gracefully. First years, attendance is mandatory. The words changed the atmosphere at the Slytherin table instantly. Upper years exchanged knowing glances. Several fifth-year boys wore expectant smirks. Pure-blood students, especially the core members from the old families, looked as if they had been waiting for this night for a long time. Avery Cuthbert immediately set down his cutlery and wiped his mouth with a napkin, excitement flashing in his eyes. Hermes Mulciber lifted his head slowly, his dark gaze scanning the 7th year's faces before settling on Regulus beside him. Only Alex Rosier, from a more moderate pure-blood branch, blinked blankly and whispered, "What's happening? Why do we have to go back?" Avery sneered, no effort made to hide his superiority and a touch of pity. "Rosier, your family didn't tell you? Really, your family, humph." "It's a tradition," Hermes said, "the Slytherin welcoming program. Let's see which of this year's little snakes has the sharpest fangs." Alex's face drained of color as understanding dawned. He glanced uneasily at Regulus, then at the other first years. The commotion drew the attention of the other houses. Whispers spread as upper years explained the tradition unique to Slytherin. Regulus felt more than one gaze from the high table. To his surprise, Dumbledore was among them. At the same time, glances came from Gryffindor. Lily Evans, James Potter, and Sirius watched too. He didn't respond. He rose silently. As the crowd filed into the dungeon common room, the mood shifted. Emerald flames flickered in the fireplace, reflecting on dark green hangings and silver decorations and on dozens of faces. Upper years clustered in small groups around sofas and armchairs, talking in low voices and watching the 10 incoming first years. The first years instinctively huddled together, but they were already divided into small cliques. The pure-blood core, Avery, Hermes, and the like, naturally stood together, expressions either arrogant or solemn. Other new students, 2 nervous-looking half-bloods in plain robes, a boy and a girl, looked isolated and helpless. Their eyes darted through the crowd and, as if by common agreement, settled on Regulus. Over the past month, Regulus's conduct had set him apart from many of the high-born pure-blood youths. He showed none of their deliberate arrogance, never took part in mindless denigration of bloodlines, and was rigorous and fair in class and in group work. To the first years who weren't part of the pure-blood core or who came from ordinary families, this second son of the Black family was almost the only freshman in Slytherin they could call reasonable and reliable. They instinctively edged closer to where Regulus stood, as if proximity offered a sliver of security. Regulus noticed the subtle shift, but gave no sign. He walked to the edge of the open space in the center of the common room and stood quietly, gray eyes scanning the room. Quiet. Lucretius Boak stepped in front of the fireplace. His voice was not loud, but solemn, and the common room fell silent immediately. "The usual rules," he said. "First years will duel in pairs. No restrictions on spells, provided you can cast them, and they won't cause Madame Pomfrey to come looking for us. The goal is for you to recognize yourselves in others. Slytherin respects power, but also the wisdom to wield it." Low discussions and snickers broke out among the upper years. "Bets are open. Bets are open," a 6th year grinned, pulling out a small notebook. "Wagering on which little rookie will be the last one standing. Odds are live, 10 galleons on the black kid from me." "Is that even a question?" A girl near him rolled her eyes. "Look at him. Does he even look 11? I bet he'll finish everyone in under 3 minutes." "You can't be sure," a bespectacled 7th year said, pushing his glasses up in a mock analytical tone. "The Mulciber boy has a dark look in his eyes. Rumor is his family keeps unusual collections. And Cuthbert isn't a pushover." "Please, look at the way Black is standing," the first 6th year said, gesturing with his chin. Everyone else is either trembling, overexcited, or pretending to be brave like Avery. But look at him. It's like he's waiting for tea in his study. I'm raising my bet. His robes won't even get a wrinkle. The talk drifted plainly into the ears of the first years. Avery flushed with a mix of excitement and anger. Alex grew more nervous, twisting at his robe's hem. The two half-bloods turned pale. Hermes' gaze on Regulus sharpened. Regulus himself stood without expression. Now we will draw lots to determine the first-round opponents. Narcissa produced a small silver cup with slips of parchment. The results were quick. Alex was paired with another nervous boy from a branch pureblood family. The half-blood girl drew Avery and went paler still. Regulus drew a pureblood boy whose face looked like he might cry when he saw the slip. "Wait!" A low voice cut through. Hermes Mulciber stepped clear of the crowd, looked at the two seventh years, then at Regulus. "I request to duel Regulus Black." Silence fell, then a hum of renewed interest. Requesting to change opponents wasn't common, but the rules didn't forbid it if both agreed. Lucretius raised an eyebrow. "Black?" All eyes turned to him. Regulus met Hermes' gaze. There was no provocation in Hermes' dark eyes, only a near-obsessive seriousness and something contained and intense. Regulus remembered the smell of something burnt in the dormitory after a night out and the nameless book with the dark red cover. "Fine," he said calmly. "However, since these are one-on-one matches held in turn, we can wait until the end and let the others finish their bouts first." The boy who'd been swapped out acted as if he'd been pardoned, nodding and hurrying away. The other first years raised no objections. Everyone could see that a duel between Regulus and Hermes would likely be on another level. The seventh years exchanged a look and agreed. "Very well, then we shall begin with the other pairings." The duels started quickly. An open space was cleared and ringed by watching students. Alex and his opponent were like two chicks pecking at each other. Both so nervous their incantations stumbled, the light from their Expelliarmus spells wobbling. Alex ultimately lost after tripping in his panic, drawing a ripple of laughter. Avery had an easier time against the half-blood girl, a neat impediment jinx to throw her off balance, followed by a precise Expelliarmus to end the fight, earning approving nods from several upper years. The other matches were much the same. As Regulus watched, it became clear that first years, even those carefully raised by their families, still had immature magical ability, weak control, and almost no practical combat experience. The practical spells from the Standard Book of Spells were already things that required solid practice. Expelliarmus, Impediment Jinx, Jellylegs Jinx, Locking Spell, Petrificus Totalis, Fire-Making Spell. Being able to cast these reliably and hit accurately was considered impressive among their peers. For Regulus, though, these spells posed little difficulty. Any charm needing precise gestures, clear pronunciation, and basic guidance was something he could learn at a glance and master with practice. His strong magical control and calculative ability compensated for his youth, making basic spells far more stable and powerful in his hands than in those of his peers. Of course, magic wasn't that simple. Spells requiring intense emotion, complex conceptual understanding, or special talent in mediums were still areas he needed to study. After several rounds, the freshmen were exhausted, some exhilarated, others dejected. In the end, only Regulus and Hermes remained standing in the center of the open space. 28, new chief. The two stood 10 feet apart and bowed slightly. "Begin," Narcissa announced. Hermes moved almost the instant she finished speaking, wand thrust forward. Jinx. A silver light shot toward Regulus. Opening a duel with a tickling Jinx wasn't vicious, but it was sudden. Regulus didn't shift his feet. With a single casual flick of his wand, an identical silver light flew out and met Hermes' spell in midair, exploding into a shower of glittering fragments. Leg locker curse. Hermes followed immediately, a blue streak skimming along the ground. Regulus tapped the earth and raised an invisible barrier in front of him. Hermes' curse hit it like a ramp, ricocheted off at an angle, and fizzled against the wall. "Impedimenta!" Hermes muttered a third spell. "Impedimenta," Regulus echoed. The two identical curses collided over the center of the clearing with a dull thud. But Regulus's version was clearly stronger. Not only did it smash Hermes' spell, it didn't dissipate, instead driving forward toward him. Hermes only just managed to dodge, rolling on the ground and looking disheveled. The underclassmen watched in wide-eyed shock, hands over their mouths. The upperclassmen only nodded. It was plain to anyone watching that the power in Regulus's magic was astonishing. He still didn't attack. Calmly, almost lazily, he blocked or deflected every one of Hermes's strikes. A binding curse was flicked aside. An incendio was snuffed by an aguamenti. He even dodged some spells with only the faintest movements. Throughout it all, Regulus stayed rooted inside the small circle where he'd begun, using nothing more than the basic defensive and disruptive charms from Standard Book of Spells Grade 1. Each performed perfectly and with effortless ease. His face never changed. He looked as though this were a lesson rather than a duel. Hermes, meanwhile, accelerated. His attacks became faster and craftier, showing a foundation in spellcasting beyond that of an ordinary first year. Clearly he had been taught before arriving at school. But his color drained and his breath grew labored. He wasn't foolish. He could see Regulus wasn't even trying. That effortless mastery humiliated him. "Is all you can do hide, Black?" Hermes snarled, a flash of anger and hard ruthlessness in his eyes. He stopped the rapid barrage, held his wand high, and began to chant in a lower, more tangled voice. A dark red light gathered at the tip of his wand, and the air around them seemed to chill. Some of the upperclassmen frowned. Prefect Lucretius stepped forward as if to intervene. Narcissa's fingers tightened on her own wand, but it was too late. "Bone and blood stripping." Hermes hissed the last syllables. A jagged beam of dark, painful light shot toward Regulus. Dark arts, unmistakably, even if the version Hermes managed to muster was incomplete and weakened. A chorus of shocked gasps rose from the room. Regulus's eyes, which had remained undisturbed until now, finally shifted. He recognized the spell. Hermes had used this curse on a living person before. Heh, family training, Regulus thought. He stopped replying with the trivial charms. Without flourish, without incantation, he raised his wand. A silver barrier, solid as crystal and patterned with flowing, precise ripples, sprang into being before him. The dark red beam smashed into the shield with a grating sizzle, like metal corroding. It frantically ate away at the barrier, but could not pierce it. After about 2 seconds, under Hermes's pale, unbelieving stare, the dark light lost its force and collapsed, leaving the silver wall intact. The moment the red glow died, Regulus stepped forward. A spot of red flared briefly at his wand tip. Expelliarmus, a red bolt, far cleaner and faster than any Hermes had cast, struck Hermes in the chest like a thunderclap. Crack! Hermes's wand flew high in an arc and spun end over end before landing cleanly in Regulus's free hand. The duel was over. That had been the courtesy Regulus extended to his roommate. Otherwise, a simple jelly-legs jinx would have put Hermes on his knees. From Hermes's first attempt at the dark curse to Regulus's disarming, the whole exchange took less than 5 seconds, so rapid that many had not yet recovered from the shock of seeing dark magic in a first-year duel. The common room held its breath. Hermes remained where he'd been knocked back to, his right hand still poised as if holding a wand. His body trembled, his face was a drained white, his eyes hollow, as if he could not accept that his secret, most relied-upon method had been undone so easily. Regulus returned the wand, stepping forward with the same unshaken calm in his voice. There was no triumph, no sneer at the dark arts, only plain, chilly clarity. A good attempt. The spell's structure was unstable, and your power supply faltered. Next time you use that, you do well to decide whether you're trying to kill me or not. Hesitation will only fail you. The single word kill, spoken as plainly as any other, froze the room. Hearing it from an 11-year-old boy sent a ripple of cold through everyone present. The upperclassmen reacted most visibly. Lucretius Boke's eyebrows rose, and a look of thin appreciation, even pleasant surprise, crossed his face. Nearby, several core pureblood students from the 5th and 6th years exchanged excited glances and began to whisper. "Did you hear that? Decide whether you're trying to kill me." Merlin, coming from a first year, elegant, powerful, and a 7th-year girl from the Caro family licked her lips, eyes glittering. He doesn't have that hypocritical squeamishness about the dark arts. He understands them. That's exactly how a Slytherin should be. Remember, the Black family may have produced a dangerous one this time, a knot boy observed, his tone careful. To them, Regulus's detached appraisal of dark magic, judging its use by skill rather than morality, resembled the values of certain ancient houses more than Hermes's clumsy imitation of dark charmery. Alex Rosier opened his mouth as if to protest, something mild, like, "It was only a duel, talk of killing is excessive," or "Hermes used a dark spell, that's wrong." But when Regulus's cool gaze slid across the room and landed on him, any words froze on his tongue. He could only lower his head and stare at his shoe tips. Avery Cuthbert stood different again. During the flying class fight, he had thought the gap between himself and Regulus might be closed with effort and tactics. Now he understood the gap was visible, plain and wide. He clenched his fists, then let them fall, and simply watched the two boys in the clearing with a tangled expression, doing nothing. Hermes Mulciber himself blinked back from the edge of collapse and fixed his hollow eyes on Regulus. Emotion churned there: humiliation, disbelief, fear, and a sliver of urgent desperation. He had been afraid. He had not dared to use the full force of that curse in front of everyone. He snatched his wand back, fingers white with grip, then lowered his head and melted into the shadowed crowd, paling into his usual gloomy mask. Ahem. Narcissa cleared her throat, breaking the charged silence. She and Lucretius exchanged a look. Tonight's orientation had done its job, and more. There was no need to drag things out. Lucretius stepped forward and swept his gaze over the remaining freshmen. "So does anyone wish to challenge Black or Mulciber?" His gaze passed slowly across the group. Alex kept his eyes down. The other first years shook their heads, avoiding contact. Even Avery, who might once have considered stepping forward, stayed rooted and silent. "In that case," Lucretius declared, voice steady, "the title of first-year chief goes to Regulus Black. I hope you all take this as your standard and work to improve yourselves." 29. Bella's letter. The clamor of the Slytherin welcome party had not yet fully died down. The crowd was thinning into twos and threes, whispering about the brief duel that had just taken place. Regulus had stepped out of the open space in the center of the common room and was preparing to return to his dormitory when a voice called his name. Regulus. It was Narcissa Black. She stood by the archway leading to the girls' dormitory. Unlike her usual company of upper-year girls, she was alone, clearly waiting for him. Several upper-year boys who had been moving to surround Regulus and offer congratulations or jeers noticed and sensibly stopped. "Cousin Narcissa," he said, and closed the distance. Narcissa said nothing, only signaled with her eyes for him to follow. They walked in single file into a quiet stone corridor branching off the common room. There were no portraits here, only cold stone and green torches burning at intervals. After glancing to make sure no one else lingered, Narcissa turned. Her face was a mixture of worry and business-like seriousness. From the sleeve of her robe, she took an envelope sealed in third wax. The stamp bore a grisly skull with a snake protruding from its mouth. The emblem was not yet public, but it was an open secret in certain circles. "A letter from Bella for you," she said in a low voice, handing it over. "She told me to give it to you only after you were sure you'd secured the position of head." Regulus took the envelope. The 30 seal felt cool, carrying a faint trace of unsettling magic. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he looked at Narcissa. She seemed to understand and exhaled softly. "The rumors outside are tightening, Regulus," she said, tiredness in her voice. "That lord's influence grows quickly. It's no longer just secret meetings and small skirmishes. He has people, those loyal to him or those who fear him, in the ministry, in the Wizengamot, even on the Hogwarts Board of Governors. Shops in Diagon Alley and Hogsmeade have quietly changed hands, and several tabloid editors who spoke against him have resigned to recuperate. 2 officials in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement who publicly questioned abuses of the Statute of Secrecy were found last month to have accidentally triggered dangerous experimental thirsts in their homes. They were badly hurt and admitted to St. Mungo's." She met his eyes. "He is resourceful and charismatic. He has woven an enormous web with promises, threats, and open displays of his power. Among the pure-blood families, the Lestranges have long been at the center. Families like Knott, Caro, and Yaxley have clearly taken sides. More are watching and weighing their options. Malfoy," she drew a breath, "Malfoy is among them too." Regulus understood. Narcissa might not fully endorse that lord's schemes of conquest and cleansing, but she was about to marry into the Malfoy family. Her fate would be bound to Lucius Malfoy and his house. She had little choice. Her assessment matched the history he knew, and her details sketched the landscape opening before that lord's rising power. "Thank you for telling me, cousin," Regulus said quietly, tucking the envelope into an inner pocket of his robes. Narcissa searched his face, trying to detect any tremor of panic or fear, but found none. Finally, she whispered, "Be careful of Bella. She's different now. Be careful of the letter, too. You're still young, but that doesn't mean you can stay out of this forever." She nodded once, turned, and hurried back toward the girls' dormitory, the hem of her robes whispering over stone. Back in the dormitory, Avery Cuthbert, Hermes Mulciber, and Alex Rosier had not yet returned. Regulus drew his bed curtains, cast a silencing charm, and broke the 30 seal. A faint scent drifted out, expensive perfume with an undercurrent of something scorched. The parchment inside was heavy. The handwriting was wild and jagged, the strokes so fierce they nearly pierced the paper. The agitation in the script betrayed the writer's unstable zeal. "To my dear Regulus, I have heard that you are beginning to make a name for yourself at Hogwarts, having won the position of Slytherin head. I am deeply gratified. The noble blood of the Black family runs in you. You have not disappointed me, the family, or that lord. This is a magnificent age, Regulus. The old order crumbles. The decadent ministry is run by cowards and mudblood sympathizers, desecrating our birthright and glory. But dawn is coming. A true king has risen. He will lead us to purge this filthy world and rebuild the eternal order that belongs to pure blood. 33. Power, glory, dominance. These are our due. You have talent, but talent alone is not enough. You must grow faster, become stronger, more unwavering. The games of Slytherin are only the beginning. The true battlefield lies beyond the castle. That lord needs loyal, powerful followers. The House of Black must occupy the most dazzling place in this new temple. Do not be deceived by weak feelings. Do not be bound by hypocritical morality. Power is truth, and truth belongs only to the victors. I have already informed that lord of your situation. He is very interested in you. A Black showing such extraordinary skill at so young an age, this reveals your potential. Remember his attention, Regulus. It is the highest honor. Let it drive you forward. Do not fail it. Be ready at all times. 32. When the summons comes, prove that you are worthy of the name Black, worthy to serve a greater cause. Your loyal and expectant Bellatrix Lestrange. Regulus folded the parchment across his knees. His face betrayed nothing. The fanaticism, paranoia, and hunger for violent power in Bella's words were stronger than he had imagined. This was no mere follower's fervor. It was pathological worship and coercion. That lord, behind Bella, had not ruled him out for being 11. The letter's claim that that lord had noticed him and took an interest was far from flattering. It meant scrutiny, trials, and the ruin that could follow if expectations were unmet. He had expected a buffer of years in which to grow his strength and choose his path, but time now felt more urgent. That lord's net was tightening, and the Black family was already entangled. A cold irritation had quietly bloomed in Regulus's usually even temper. When he stepped out into the common room again, many students remained. Near the fireplace, he saw Alge Travers, a fifth year whose pride Regulus had publicly wounded at the term's start, surrounded by several lackeys from 10. They lounged as if the hearth were theirs, speaking in tones low enough to be sly, their eyes flicking toward the dormitory corridor. Spotting Regulus, Travers raised his voice on purpose. So, no matter how clever he is, he's still just a baby who needs looking after. What does being head of the first years even mean? A true Slytherin thinks long-term about real influence, one of Travers's cronies added. Does he really think he's important because he was praised a few times for a bit of cleverness and luck? Low chuckles ran around them. A few upper years who remained watched with the look of people waiting for entertainment. They all knew of the friction between Travers and Regulus. Travers's interruption was a crude bid to humiliate the new head while his reputation was high. Such scenes were nothing new in Slytherin. Avery Cuthbert and Alex Rosier sat in the nearby sofas. Avery frowned and watched the exchange. Alex looked uneasy. Hermes Mulciber, who had been lurking in a corner, moved closer and stood about 5 meters away, silent. Travers, A sixth-year girl who had praised Regulus earlier said sharply, "That's enough. He's only a first year." First year? Travers sneered, and finally turned his head to look directly at Regulus, malice and triumphant provocation on his face. A first year who already knows how to use some obscure tricks learned from who knows where against upper years? A first year who makes people swoon and orbit around him? I'm merely stating facts. When you're young, you should keep a low profile and learn to respect your seniors, not get arrogant because you have a little talent. Do you really think being head of the Slytherins is such an achievement? Traverse's words grew nastier, deliberately twisting facts and reducing Regulus's talents to nothing more than parlor tricks and luck. Regulus kept his head slightly bowed and said nothing. He knew Travers was baiting him, trying to force him into making the first move. If Regulus struck first, Travers could claim self-defense and salvage whatever pride he had left. Travers clearly believed that if he kept his composure and treated the fight seriously, he would never be humiliated again. The chatter around them died away as everyone turned to watch Regulus, waiting for him to snap. Heat of indignation built slowly in Regulus's chest as he listened to the malice. Looking at Travers' calculating face, which was twisted with arrogance, he found the whole scene suddenly laughable and exhausting. There were always people who refused to see clearly. He let the corners of his mouth lift into a smile so cold it felt sharp. The expression startled those who knew him. Avery and Alex exchanged a worried glance. Both sensed that something in Regulus had shifted. Even Hermes, lurking in the shadows, froze for a heartbeat. Snape, in the dim corner, watched closely, his dark eyes narrowing as if at a different boy altogether. Regulus did not explode into rage or snap back as Travers wanted. He didn't even glance at the upperclassmen waiting for a show. He took 2 calm steps forward and spoke in a flat, cold voice. "Save your clumsy provocation, Travers. You want me to attack first so you can claim the moral high ground of self-defense and salvage your pathetic pride. It's a childish trick, and you're very thorough at it." He watched the color drain from Travers's face and continued in that unnervingly controlled tone. "Like a clown." 3 words, light as they were, landed like hard slaps. Regulus raised the hand holding his wand. "So let's not waste time. Draw your wand." The Slytherin common room fell silent, broken only by the occasional crackle from the fire. Traverse's face shifted between shame at being exposed and fury at being mocked. He had not expected Regulus to ruin his scheme so bluntly in front of everyone. "Fine," Travers snapped, whipping out his wand and pointing it at Regulus, mouth twisted with rage. "If you're so arrogant, I'll show you the difference between a senior and a junior and teach you how to respect your elders." The crowd moved instinctively aside, reopening the central space as whispers swelled. Travers actually thinks he can lecture everyone. Black tore the mask off him like it was nothing. A 5th year against at least Black beat him before. That was a sneak attack, though, wasn't it? Look how he blocked that dark arts spell. Mulciber was a first year the other time. Travers has been studying properly for 5 years, after all. This will be good. Avery clenched his fists. Alex shut his eyes. Hermes leaned against a pillar, his dark gaze fixed on the center. Lucretius did not intervene. In Slytherin, private, consensual duels were often allowed so long as no lasting harm came of them. "Start!" shouted an upperclassman who loved the chaos. Travers attacked immediately, remembering his mistake last time. "Stupefy." A brilliant jet of red hurtled toward Regulus's face. Regulus flicked his wand almost lazily. A flash of light intercepted the curse. Travers shifted tactics. "Incendio!" A hissing snake of flame shot from his wand. Regulus stood his ground and performed a brief upward flick, an extinguishing charm. The fire vanished as if someone had swallowed its heat. Regulus's voice was flat. "Is that all?" Before Travers could react, Regulus flicked again. A jelly-legs jinx hit with pinpoint precision. Travers's legs went rubbery. He began to pitch forward when an impedimenta struck his upper body. Bang! 2 spells in quick succession sent him flipping into the air. Before he could land, another impedimenta followed. Bang! Travers sailed through the air like a rag doll. The swift, small combos made the watching upperclassmen wince. "Ouch," a 6th-year girl murmured, rubbing her shoulders. "That must hurt." "More than that, Travers must be mortified," another muttered. Look at Black's spells, nonverbal fast, and his transitions are so smooth, exclaimed a fourth year. Others exchanged uncertain looks. Could you dodge like that? Maybe. Would you want to try? Probably not. Muddy ground. Travers, still stunned by the last hits and flying through the air, landed in a patch of churned earth and sank. Reducto, he cried, firing a blasting curse to clear himself free. As the spell left his wand, an empty armchair beside him came alive, the wood groaning and stretching, reforming into a giant python nearly 10 meters long. The python slithered soundlessly, coiled around Travers's waist, yanking him out of the mire, and then tightened. Ah! Travers screamed, wand flailing. Defindo! The spell struck the snake, shredding a few scales to reveal flesh beneath. A smear of blood showed where the spell landed. The creature only tightened further, crushing the air from Travers's lungs. Let go! Let go of me! He choked, face reddening. Regulus walked over with composed steps, watching the pathetic, struggling boy wrapped in his conjured snake. His expression was unreadable. With a leisurely flick of his wand, the python began to move, dragging the helpless Travers in slow circles around the open space. One lap, two, like parading a ridiculous trophy. Enough! Let him go! A sixth year who had ties to the Travers family shouted, unable to stomach it. Regulus glanced at him with a look that shut the boy up immediately. Only when Travers's eyes rolled back from lack of oxygen and humiliation did Regulus finally lose interest. He flicked his wand. The python loosened and collapsed, the fabric of the armchair torn and the wood warped, dropping to the floor. Travers collapsed like a beached fish, coughing and retching. His robes were soaked with spit. Tears and snot ran down his face. His wand was somewhere out of reach. The common room was silent. All eyes were on the dark-haired boy, neat and composed as ever, as though he had been out for a walk. With nothing more than basic charms and an inventive piece of transfiguration, he had toyed with a senior in front of the whole house, never allowing the other boy so much as to touch his robes. Some wondered, not without fear, whether Black might have killed Travers if they hadn't been in a crowded room. The python's tightening had been visible to everyone. Travers had been close to suffocating. This was no mere win or loss. It was a demonstration of attitude and skill, laced with cruelty. Regulus did not look at the broken figure on the floor again, nor at the shocked, admiring, or frightened faces around him. The immediate irritation in his chest had eased with the one-sided display, but a colder urgency had settled deeper inside. He sheathed his wand, turned, and walked in silence toward the corridor that led to the dormitories. Avery opened his mouth, thought better of it, and stayed silent. Alex remained stunned. Hermes watched Regulus's retreating back with an expression no one could read, glanced once at the prostrate Travers, then melted back into the shadows. After tonight, the name Regulus Black would carry different meanings in Slytherin. 31. Light up the fourth star. Silence filled the dormitory. Regulus drew the heavy bed curtains closed and cast wards for soundproofing and anti-prying, shutting himself off from everything outside. The praise, the gossip, the wary calculations, and the fanatical warmth still lingering in Bella's letter. He sat cross-legged on the bed, closed his eyes, and let his awareness sink inward. His basic magical circulation followed its familiar path, washing over and nourishing his body, strengthening skin, muscle, tendon, and bone. In the upper layers of his consciousness, his mental power began to condense and weave. One by one, the 3 stars of Orion's belt lit up in the darkness of his mind, moving with a slow, almost imperceptible momentum. The star orbit guided meditation took hold, smoothing his scattered thoughts with its vast imagery. When his mind had finally stilled, Regulus reached for the 4th star. Things had been progressing faster than expected. He needed to accelerate. Synchronizing the 3 belt stars had only been the beginning, a threshold for the method. He projected his attention toward Orion's brilliant right shoulder, the red supergiant Betelgeuse, which glowed with a dark, ruddy aura. He had to incorporate this new point into the dynamic system while preserving the moving pattern of the 3 belt stars. Betelgeuse had its own trajectory. Its position and motion relative to the belt formed the upper body framework of Orion. The difficulty spiked. Simulating stellar motion was 100 times harder than constructing a static model. It demanded precise calculation, powerful spatial imagination, and absolute control of his magic. He needed to hold the exact relative positions of the light points in his mind while making each point move slowly, almost imperceptibly, yet in accordance with celestial laws. It was like manipulating multiple lights, each following different, complex paths, while keeping the overall figure intact. The task required relentless concentration and constant recalculation. Any distraction would skew a trajectory and topple the entire dynamic balance. That glacial slowness did not lessen the difficulty. It became an extra burden because the motion had to be maintained continuously. Simulating movement that was nearly static required patience, precision, and incessant fine-tuning. Regulus first located Betelgeuse in his consciousness, a dark red point slightly larger than the belt stars, settling above and to the right. Then came the harder part, imparting momentum. Betelgeuse's motion parameters differed from the belts. Its direction and cadence were not the same. Regulus had to dedicate a portion of his mind just to calculating and sustaining Betelgeuse's trend while coordinating its geometry with the three belt stars. Distances, angles, and headings all shifted slowly as each point moved. When he first injected Betelgeuse's motion, the previously steady three-star model immediately shuddered. The belt star's trajectories grew disorderly and the whole structure teetered. He stopped, retreated to maintaining only the three stars, stabilized them, and tried again with far greater caution. This time, he introduced Betelgeuse as a static point first, letting its relative positions settle with the belt. Then, very slowly and subtly, he began to add the calculated momentum while simultaneously fine-tuning the belt star's own motions to accommodate the new variable and seek a fresh equilibrium. The process was mercilessly draining. His spirit felt like a taut bowstring. A headache throbbed at his temples. Managing a four-star dynamic model consumed far more mental energy than three, almost exponentially more. Time slipped away in silent confrontation and adjustment. At last, after an indeterminate span, something within his mind clicked into place. Betelgeuse's dark red light stopped feeling like a jarring addition. It harmonized with the movement of the belt stars. The simple quadrilateral the 4 points formed began to move as one in the void of his consciousness, synchronized and steady. It was a success. The preliminary 4-star dynamic model had been constructed. Regulus held the configuration, attentively observing the subtle changes. The drain on his mental reserves was enormous, but a deeper calm accompanied it, and a faint sense of satisfaction as if his soul had widened. Lighting the 4th star had improved the layering and stability of his meditation state. His perception of the free-floating magic in the surrounding environment sharpened too. He eased out of the deep meditation and glanced at the three by his bed. From the moment he began attempting the 4th star to its initial stabilization had taken nearly 2 hours, and that was only the time for adding 1 star on top of an already mastered 3-star model. It was obvious, as the number of stars in the model increased, their dynamic relationships would grow more complex. Each additional star integrated into the system would demand vastly more time, calculation, and mental load. Yet, there was another side to it. Continuous, intense tempering would toughen his spirit and improve his capacity for calculation and spatial imagination. That, in turn, would gradually speed the process of lighting further stars. The progression would be a spiral, slow and grinding at first, then accelerating as a solid foundation developed. Still, the real obstacle was not simply adding more stars, but achieving solidification. Dynamism was the essence of this method and its greatest difficulty. He would have to recalculate, reconstruct, and remaintain the moving model each time he meditated. It would not become an instinctive pathway in the way a fixed meditation pattern could be solidified. To make this dynamic star orbit system reach the realm of spontaneous functioning, occurring whether he walked, sat, or slept, was as hard as ascending to heaven. Solidification normally implied fixity. He was trying to harden something that was meant to be in perpetual motion. That required his spirit's foundational layer to become an active structure that could automatically process complex dynamic changes and fine-tune synchronization. Although the road ahead was long, the path was visible. Regulus closed his eyes once more, not to attempt a 5th star tonight, but to consolidate. Tonight's success with the 4th star was a breakthrough. It needed to become more natural, more stable. He let the star orbits extend and settle through breaths, calculations, and tiny adjustments. News of Regulus's rout of fifth-year Alge Travers spread like cold water on boiling oil through Slytherin and the wider pure-blood circles at Hogwarts. Slytherin prized power, but also the cunning to use it. When raw power and shrewdness combined and were displayed so decisively, the impact was immense. Overnight, Regulus's standing within Slytherin shifted. Upperclassmen no longer glanced at him as they might a promising junior. Their looks carried respect and a hint of caution. Fewer people said foolish things around him. Young purebloods who had kept their distance from the Black family because of politics or Sirius's incident now looked at the air with different eyes. The Black family might really be on the rise this time, a seventh year whispered to his friend at breakfast. Look at the power he showed and how casually he used dark arts, the friend replied. That's exactly the kind of thing certain people admire. What matters is strength, the first said soberly. He's only a first year and played a fifth-year Travers like a puppet. Imagine when he's finished his education. Lord Voldemort is at the height of his power now, the friend said. If the Blacks produce someone like that, their future. Similar conversations echoed in many corners. Pragmatism was a Slytherin rule of survival. When the balance of power shifted, people adjusted their posture and reassessed alliances. The Owl Post was unusually busy in the days that followed. Many Slytherin pupils, especially upperclassmen with influential family ties, wrote home about the duel and the formidable strength Regulus had displayed. Strength far beyond his age. On Thursday morning, just after Transfiguration, a seventh year stopped Regulus in the corridor. Black, Professor Slughorn would like you to come to his office, the student said, his tone polite and faintly deferential. Regulus nodded, gathered his things, and headed for the dungeons. 32. Slughorn Horace Slughorn's office, like the man himself, exuded a carefully cultivated air of comfort and prosperity. The room smelled faintly of exotic, expensive potion ingredients. The walls were covered with photographs of famous witches and wizards. Silver instruments gleamed on the desk, and the armchairs were upholstered in thick velvet. Ah! Regulus, my dear boy, come in. Slughorn greeted him warmly, his rotund belly leading the way, his face all smiles. Sit, sit! A spot of mead? Or a lemon sherbet? Thank you, Professor, but no. Thank you, Regulus answered politely, taking the offered chair with proper, relaxed posture. He watched Slughorn with a careful, assessing eye. The professor was nothing if not shrewd, expert at gathering promising students into a web of favors and obligations. He valued talent, pedigree, and future usefulness, but he also knew how to read a room and avoid unnecessary risks. A classic Slytherin opportunist, not an evil man, merely a consummate collector of influence. I heard about the little incident in the common room last night, Slughorn said, rubbing his hands together, his gooseberry-colored eyes twinkling. That Travers boy, always so impulsive, not quite grown up yet. But you handled it very well, very decently, quite the style one expects of the House of Black. Regulus felt a flash of amusement and a little incredulity. I beat him up like that, and you call it decency? And what exactly is the Black style, bullying people? He simply inclined his head and accepted the professor's compliment with the required modesty. With your talent and temperament, Slughorn went on in a lowered voice, leaning forward as if sharing a confidence, I shouldn't be surprised if you become someone of consequence in the wizarding world. I do love to see excellent young people flourish. If you need help with potions or anything else, my club, my collection, even some of my small connections are always at your disposal. Regulus understood perfectly. Slughorn would not name Lord Voldemort, but his meaning was clear. He expected a new order on the horizon and was already investing in students likely to do well in it. Regulus adjusted his expression to an appropriate, youthful humility. Thank you very much for your confidence, Professor. Actually, I'm curious about a rather obscure direction in potions. Perhaps you could advise me? Oh, tell me about it. Slughorn brightened at once. Regulus chose his words carefully, posing his curiosity as a student's intellectual question. I was reading about sacrificial rituals, he said. Some priests drew complex totems or runes on their skin that were said to communicate briefly with some kind of power. I wondered if it was possible to create an external medium by potion, something you could apply to the skin that would adhere safely and slowly release its properties. In other words, can a potion be made into a written, topical form that gives controlled effects? Slughorn rubbed his double chin and considered seriously. An interesting idea, very ancient, very obscure. Drawing runes directly on the skin is extremely risky, but using a potion as a medium, there are some records. For example, ancient northern peoples would apply ointments of dragon's blood, powdered troll heart, and frost crystal flowers to gain strength, but the side effects were enormous. To make something safe, durable, and specific involves material stability, skin permeability, and controlled release of magical power. Oh, and preventing magical conflict and backlash. That's rather complex, my boy. The professor grew visibly excited. The academic puzzle had caught him. Not impossible, mind you. I recall a basic carrier formula in the appendix of Hidden Pharmaceutics that might work. And there are witch doctors in Wagado who paint runes with plant juices and mineral powders to increase resistance to certain magic. I ought to cross-reference that. I'll need to consult some references and run the deductions. He leant closer, eyes eager. If you're truly interested, perhaps over the holidays we can have theoretical discussions and try a few safe, basic formulas. Absolute caution, of course. Exactly what I had in mind, Professor, Regulus said with a slight bow. Thank you for your guidance. He left Slughorn's office feeling invigorated. An important plank had been laid under one of his plans. At lunch, 2 owls of very different bearing landed at once and dropped 2 letters before him. The first was from his mother, Walburga, the handwriting exuberant and fierce. My proud son. Word has reached us. You stood up to the provocateur and defended the dignity and glory of the blacks. Well done. This is how a black heir should behave. Silence the doubters. Your father and I are immensely proud. Continue to show your strength. Let all see that the House of Black will take its rightful place in the coming changes. We stand ready to answer that Lord's call and fight for the future of purebloods. You will be our sword and our glory. Keep your edge, my Regulus. Remember your mission and your blood. Between the lines lay fanaticism, pride, and wholehearted agreement with Voldemort's cause. Regulus folded the parchment without surprise. The second letter from his father Orion was steady and measured. Regulus, I have heard of your recent conduct. Exercise restraint in how you display your abilities. Do not make unnecessary enemies. Slytherin politics are complicated. Strength is a foundation, but the ability to adapt and weigh options is how you establish yourself for the long term. The situation beyond Hogwarts is becoming more fraught, and matters at home remain delicate. Your mother is currently very proactive. Be aware of that in your heart. Focus on your studies and on improving your skills. Hogwarts is still stable enough. Make good use of its resources. I have updated your library access. You may now consult shelves 7 through 12. Knowledge brings not only power but wisdom. 2 letters, 2 entirely different attitudes. Regulus tucked both away with a practiced calm. He knew his father was warning of stormy times to come. His mother, impatient, wanted to plunge into them. At the Gryffindor table, a shadow had fallen over one corner. Sirius Black poked at the mashed potatoes with irritation, his expression dark. He had, naturally, heard about Regulus. Part of him was shocked, but not entirely surprised. He had long known his younger brother was different, though not to this extent. What unsettled Sirius wasn't envy of Regulus's display of strength. It was fear. The brighter Regulus shone, and the more he fulfilled the expectations of Slytherin and pureblood circles, the likelier he was to be noticed and pulled into that darker orbit. The thought of Regulus one day wearing the black robes of a Death Eater and standing behind that man made Sirius's chest tighten. Hey, Sirius, don't look so grim. James Potter clapped his friend on the shoulder, assuming he was simply annoyed by the young Slytherin's posturing. It's just beating some fifth-year idiot. That Travers wasn't anything special. Your brother got a lucky edge, maybe a nasty trick. Sirius only shook his head and said nothing. James took the silence for agreement and leaned in, lowering his voice. Don't worry, mate. I've never liked the lad. He was showing off on the train. I wrote to my dad about that method of solidifying spells directly. Rare, but it has drawbacks. It either gobbles massive energy or it's useless against fast, dense attacks. Remus and Peter and I talked it over. We'll find a chance to teach him a lesson and get a bit of payback. Sirius suddenly looked up. James, don't. We know what we're doing, James said confidently, winking. We'll catch him alone, quick and clean, leave him with a memory he won't forget. Remus frowned faintly from the edge of the conversation, as if he wanted to intervene. Seeing James so fired up and Sirius so quiet, he only sighed softly. Peter nodded nervously, his small eyes flicking between them. Sirius opened his mouth with a word of restraint on his lips, then swallowed it. He knew James meant well, and that once James decided on something, it was hard to dissuade him. And, if he was honest with himself, there was also a small, darker curiosity. He wanted to see whether James and the others could provoke Regulus into showing more of what he was capable of. 33. Poor Potter Thursday afternoon, after History of Magic. Regulus walked alone down a secluded corridor leading to the library, clutching his books. Professor Bin's droning lecture still lingered in his mind as he mulled over 17th-century goblin metalwork and magical runes. 3 figures suddenly rounded the corner up ahead and blocked his path. James Potter stood in the center, a cocky smirk pasted across his face. Remus Lupin lingered a little behind him, brow furrowed and posture slightly tense. Peter Pettigrew cowered at the back, eyes flicking wildly. "Well, look who it is, Slytherin's little chief," James drawled. "Alone? Where's the chief's lackeys?" Regulus stopped. He glanced over the 3, his gaze lingering on Lupin. The brown-haired boy looked tired and taut, not aggressive like James, nor craven like Peter, but like someone forcing himself to stay composed. Regulus scanned him more carefully and felt a raw, restless magic locked inside, old, animal, carrying the chill of blood and moonlight. It didn't fit Lupin's gentle manner. Werewolf, the thought came, almost absurd in its triviality. He imagined worse possibilities and dismissed them. He knew Lupin's secret, but a werewolf to Regulus was simply that, nothing worth more attention. He had no intention of exposing him. He could let them go on calling one another friends. Sirius was not with them, which suited Regulus well. It was mildly amusing and mildly tiresome all at once, like encountering a band of squabbling children in the road. "Potter," Regulus said, voice flat. "If your intellect is as barren as your mind, I suggest you go straight to the hospital wing instead of wasting whatever brain you have on such unoriginal provocations." James's face flushed. I what?" Regulus cut him off, mockery barely restrained. "Do you think this is some valiant game? Looking for trouble, fighting, proving who's better? Is your life so simple that Quidditch, pranks, and childish stunts are all you have?" He watched James, and for a moment he saw not only the angry schoolboy, but the man who would later stand against far grimmer things: blunt courage, unrefined and dangerously earnest. Admirable in its way, but crude and naive, the world did not bend to such uncomplicated ideals. James, humiliated and raging, drew his wand. "Rictus Empra, Petrificus Totalis." 2 spells, one aimed high and one low, were sent at him together. The speed showed practice, faster than most younger students, but still slow to Regulus. He barely shifted his feet and traced a lazy semicircle with his wand. Protego, a bright silver shield, sprang up. James's spells smashed into it and exploded into sparks. The barrier did not falter. "What?" James blinked in surprise. While he hesitated, Regulus flicked his wand forward. "Expelliarmus." James twisted, trying to roll clear in an instinctive display of athleticism. It did nothing. Regulus had already read his movements. A concentrated jet of red light struck James in the chest and threw him back with a cry. His wand flew from his hand. Regulus plucked it out of the air with a levitation charm. "Petrificus Talis." A 3rd spell shot out and struck Lupin's shoulder as he moved. He froze mid-step, rigid and shocked. Peter, terrified, hadn't even drawn his wand. At a casual flick from Regulus, invisible cords sprang up and bound him where he stood. The whole thing took less than 10 seconds. Silence fell in the corridor. James clutched his chest, panting. Lupin leaned against the wall, frozen until Regulus lowered the spell. Peter whimpered as the ropes held him down. Regulus walked over and looked down at James, face twisted with pain and disbelief. "Is that what you call confidence?" he said, more lecturing than triumphant. He tossed James' wand back into his hand. "Go back and read more, Potter, or look at what others are doing. Learn from people who are actually good." He turned to leave. Footsteps echoed from the other end of the corridor. Regulus paused and then released Lupin and Peter. Lupin sagged, bracing himself, and Peter slumped to the floor in shaky relief. "James Potter, what have you done now?" Lily Evans came running, hair flying, breathless and angry. Rumors had reached her, and she had rushed over. For a heartbeat, she just stared, taking in Regulus's composed figure and the disheveled trio before him. Her face went blank. "It seems you're late, Miss Evans," Regulus said, nodding once, calm but not unkind. He looked back at James with cool gray eyes. "This is the last time, Potter," he spoke quietly. "I don't care for your childish games, and I have no interest in indulging your pride. This is the second time you've deliberately provoked me. There won't be a third. If you do it again, it won't be as merciful." The words hit James hard. He wanted to retort, to curse, but the pain in his chest and the memory of being rendered helpless moments before choked the anger into something harder and colder. He understood. Any future provocation would bring worse consequences. Regulus's tone had made that clear. "Actually," Regulus said, turning to Lily, "I was just heading to the library to look up some potions material. Care to come?" Lily looked from James to Regulus, then hesitated before nodding. "All right, I have a potions essay too." They walked off together, leaving James behind. He watched their retreating backs, his face shifting through shades of pallor, feeling a thorough, unfamiliar defeat. Lupin stood against the wall and watched Regulus's direction go out of sight, his expression complicated, guilt threading through it. Twice now they had been the ones to pick a fight. Regulus, though a Slytherin, had never been known to prey on the weak. They, particularly James, relied on numbers and on being better than other students at dueling to humiliate those they disliked, then laugh it off. Lupin helped James to his feet. Peter scrambled up, white-faced and still trembling at how quickly it had all happened. James clung to his wand until his knuckles were white, replaying the seconds over and over. Spells blocked, wand taken, Remus frozen, Peter bound. He had not forgotten Regulus's warning. He had to be smarter, stronger, or patient before he could erase the humiliation. A head-on charge would no longer do. "Let's go," James said at last, the words squeezed out through clenched teeth. He shrugged off Lupin's hand and stalked toward Gryffindor Tower without looking back, heavy-footed and furious. Lupin and Peter exchanged a glance and hurried after him. 34. Bloodline, Stance, and Reality. In a quiet corner of the library, candlelight warmed the thick pages of a heavy tome. Lily Evans finally set it aside. She looked up at Regulus across from her, her green eyes bright with earnest curiosity. "That duel in the Slytherin common room, the one against a fifth year. I heard about it." She lowered her voice, careful and unbiased. "They said you only used basic spells, but the results were completely different, as if we weren't using the same textbook. How did you manage that?" Regulus raised an eyebrow in mild surprise. He hadn't expected her to bring it up, though on reflection, it made sense. Internal Slytherin affairs were never supposed to be public knowledge. That was the understanding among Slytherins, as with the dark arts display at the welcome party. Still, Travers's provocation and sudden defeat made for irresistible gossip, and no one would keep that secret for him. He looked at Lily and could tell her curiosity held no malice, only a fascination with magic itself. That made him willing to explain a little. "The spells themselves are in the books," he said calmly. "The difference is in how they're used." "You mean there's a trick to it? Understanding, practice, the body, and consciousness." Regulus flicked his wand and murmured an imperturbable charm. "Understanding the essence of a spell, what magical properties it mobilizes, what element or energy it acts upon, and what change it intends to produce. Practice means countless hours until the spell is almost instinctive. The incantation, the gestures, and the outward magical effect must be perfectly synchronized, with no excess or hesitation. The body, dueling isn't about standing still and chanting. You must move to avoid spells, adjust your angles for better casting positions, and maintain balance to respond at any moment. A strong physique and quick reflexes are part of your combat power." He paused, then added, "This is a point many students overlook." Finally, consciousness. Regulus's gray eyes looked especially deep in the candlelight. Predicting your opponent's intentions, calculating trajectories and intersections of spells, and making the optimal choice in an instant. Often a duel is a contest of consciousness before it becomes a collision of magic. he thought briefly. Of course, that's only for conventional duels. It doesn't touch the more profound arts. It doesn't apply to everyone, Lord Voldemort, Dumbledore, Grindelwald, and in my future, myself. Lily listened, astonished. She had never heard anyone analyze wizard dueling with such clarity and structure. At Hogwarts, the professors taught youngsters the pronunciation and gestures of spells and stressed practice, but they rarely linked spellwork so deeply to the caster's overall quality. She felt a faint but widening gap between Muggleborns and peers from ancient wizarding families. She began to ask whether that wasn't unfair. Children of pureblood families were introduced to these deeper concepts early, while others, seeing the movement in her face, Regulus gave a small shake of his head. It doesn't have to do with being pureblood, he said. Family heritage can provide earlier exposure to these ideas. That's only knowing. Moving from knowing to doing requires research, practice, and personal reflection. Many pureblood students remain only at the knowing level or neglect practice out of arrogance. My level comes more from my own investment. His words were a splash of cold water, knocking Lily out of her half-formed sense of grievance. She remembered now how Professor Slughorn had praised both her and Severus for their potential and how they'd improve through hard work. Resources might be unequal, but effort and insight are things anyone can cultivate. Regulus wasn't defending a pureblood monopoly. He was stressing the decisive role of personal effort, which made his view easier for her to accept. She nodded, thoughtful, but she wondered, would many other purebloods say the same? The conversation drifted into deeper territory. Lily hesitated, then asked a worry that had been nagging her for some time. Lately, the atmosphere at school has felt odd, especially in Slytherin and among some older pureblood students in other houses. They whisper about that person or you-know-who and sound almost fanatical. Is something happening outside? Regulus was silent for a moment. He knew Lily had grown up in the Muggle world and lacked much of the wizarding world's background, but her instincts had caught the unease. Key details wouldn't be given to someone of her background, of course, but Regulus did not mind offering a little more. The wizarding world is on the verge of change, he said carefully, avoiding names. A powerful wizard advocating pureblood supremacy is rising and has gathered support among many ancient families. He believes purebloods should reassert absolute rule over the wizarding world and purge impure elements. Lily's eyes widened. That's absurd, all because of who someone was born to. Whether it's absurd depends on your standpoint. Regulus's voice stayed even. For many old families, they hold most of the wizarding world's wealth, knowledge, and influence. That dominance has lasted centuries, and they see it as a natural right tied to bloodline. The rising number of half-bloods and Muggleborns threatens that perceived right and purity. This wizard's arguments appeal to those anxieties and ambitions. He looked at her earnestly. The pureblood families you see in other houses, Potter, Longbottom, Prewett, Weasley, they may be more open or content with the status quo, but in Slytherin and among many families closely linked to it, things are different. Lily bit her lip. Her voice dropped to a whisper. And you? You must support that view, right? You're a Black. Black is practically a synonym for pureblood. Regulus didn't answer at once. He turned his gaze toward the darkening sky outside the window, as if he could see the turmoil beyond Hogwarts. Bloodline, he said slowly, is like an old key that can open certain doors. It grants access to resources and perspectives others rarely reach. It represents tradition and vested interests. I can't deny I enjoy and make use of what it brings. He met Lily's eyes again with an honest look. But bloodline doesn't equal wisdom, nor does it define character, and it certainly doesn't determine a person's whole worth. Historically, many who advanced magic were not pureblood. Blaming everything on bloodline is lazy and narrow-minded. The stance of many pureblood families is less about conviction and more about preserving existing interests and dominance. They monopolize knowledge and resources, and through marriage, form a closed, powerful class. He almost snorted inwardly. In his past life, he had a dog with a very pure pedigree. It was pretty and delicate, but he hadn't noticed it being any smarter than a mutt. Hearing such a cool appraisal, Lily was shaken. She hadn't expected someone from the most prominent, pure-blood family to speak of bloodlines so clinically. He wasn't zealous or defensive. He was making a calm historical and interest-based analysis. She began to wonder whether Regulus Black was the kind of pure-blood supremacist she had imagined. If she'd asked him outright, he might have said he could be, or he could refuse to be. They returned to their books. Regulus searched for records about certain rare rituals, slow-release magical matrices, and the stability of deep enchantments. The material he turned through went well beyond ordinary OOL work and even touched on any T-level content. Lily had initially been merely curious, but when Regulus quietly asked pointed questions or made incisive remarks about difficult passages, she was once again struck by the depth of his knowledge. He seemed to be researching an obscure, advanced topic. "What are you studying?" she asked before she could stop herself. "This is very specialized." Regulus looked up and considered for a few seconds. Lily's talent in potions was noted by Slughorn and others. She had a sharp mind and keen curiosity. She could be a useful ally. But he couldn't reveal his real purpose. Still, he allowed himself a measured reply, careful not to give away more than he intended. 35. A brief history of soul magic. "The family is investigating some ancient external potion formulas," Regulus said after a moment's thought. "Something like the old elixirs, but hopefully safer and more controllable. We need a potion base that can safely adhere to the skin, reliably carry, and steadily release specific magical effects." Lily's eyes lit up. This clearly awakened her academic curiosity. "So you're talking about moving potions from internal use to topical application, and it has to be compatible with a wizard's own magic. That's fascinating." "Can I help?" she blurted. "If you need someone to analyze formulas or test basic material combinations, I'd love to." Regulus looked into her eager face and saw only the love of study. He nodded. "If you're interested and willing to put in the time, I do need a reliable collaborator. There may be no significant results in the short term," he warned. "This could take up a lot of your spare time." "That doesn't matter," Lily said without hesitation. "Working on something like this is reward enough. And," she hesitated, sincere now, "thank you for telling me about magic, about what's out there, and about the paper methodology last time. I feel like we're friends now. Friends help each other." Regulus's expression softened. "Yes, friends, I'm grateful for your help. If you ever need my insight or help with magic, in the future ask me," she said, smiling. They understood friendship as exchange, not one-sidedness. As they parted, Regulus earnestly told her, "There's no need to tell anyone what I've said." Lily nodded solemnly. "I promise." That night, Regulus prepared for a different kind of work, the restricted section. An invisibility cloak would have been ideal, but he had none. The disillusionment charm would have to do. It was advanced magic, usually beyond the reach of lower-year students, but the House of Black's records contained detailed instructions, and he had already memorized the principles. The disillusionment charm wasn't true invisibility so much as optical camouflage. It demanded precise control of magic and steady concentration, qualities Regulus possessed. He found an abandoned broom cupboard on the 7th floor, locked the door, and began. On his first attempt, he concentrated, spoke the incantation, and let his magic spread across the surface of his body. He felt light beginning to distort, but the effect was wildly unstable, like looking through violently rippling water. His silhouette blurred and flickered. He still stood out. A failure. The output was uneven and the manipulation of light too crude. On the second attempt, he adjusted the flow of magic to cover his body more smoothly. The result improved, but he looked like a patchwork chameleon, the colors not quite matching the wall. Any slight movement would betray him. Still no good. The simulation wasn't precise enough. Third, fourth, he kept adjusting everything. The incantation, the gestures, the intensity and texture of the magic, even how he perceived the surrounding light and shadow so he could mimic them more accurately. On the 5th try, he closed his eyes and guided the magic like the finest paintbrush, painting patterns of light and shade across his skin that matched the background perfectly. When he opened his eyes, his raised hand had nearly vanished, blending with the brick behind it. As he moved, the texture shifted in perfect sync. Success. But Regulus wasn't satisfied. Madame Pince might rely on eyesight alone, but other means of detection existed. Could he hide from magical sensing? From Muggle sensors? a new idea formed. Build an extremely thin isolation layer on his skin that not only distorted light, but also dampened heat and scent, and even smoothed out magical fluctuations. That was more difficult than a simple disillusionment charm. It required multi-layered, precise weaving of different kinds of magic. After 2 more false starts, on the 3rd try, he began with the light-distorting outer layer and wove an inner lining of finer magical threads. That lining did nothing offensive or defensive. Its purpose was to absorb and neutralize the faint thermal radiation his body emitted and to quiet the ripples of magic on the surface. He felt himself grow fainter to magical perception. It wasn't perfect, nothing could make him vanish completely, but it was enough to fool most conventional detection, wizard or muggle. He dispelled the spell and breathed. The castle lay in deep sleep. Regulus slipped through the corridors once more beneath the improved disillusionment charm, his figure merging into the stone of the dim hallway. Like an incorporeal shadow, he slid past sleeping portraits, avoided Filch's patrols, and reached the library's restricted section. The air there felt colder, thick with the smell of parchment, dust, and old magic. He went straight to the place in his memory and located the book, A Brief History of Soul Magic, tucked in the lower corner. The volume was warded. Forcing it open or removing it would trigger alarms and possibly ruin the book. He didn't need to take it. He held his right hand an inch above the spine and closed his eyes. His spirit, already powerful and further honed, was far keener than an ordinary student's. He spread his magic like an invisible scanner and began to read. Regulus perceived every trace of magic embedded in the pages, the thoughts the author had poured into the words, the residue of spell work that had solidified in the parchment. This way of reading strained the mind and couldn't perfectly reproduce every detail, but it was sufficient. Obscure, profound knowledge flowed into him like a tide, the nature of the soul and the source of magic, factors affecting soul stability, the manifestations and consequences of soul damage. Then the book reached the taboo. Horcruxes. His magic tightened as he touched that passage. The book described the feasibility of the forbidden act. Through monstrous rituals and the most vile of dark arts, a soul could be torn apart. A fragment could be severed and sealed into a vessel, a Horcrux. As long as that container endured, the main soul would not truly die with the body. It could persist and, through dark rites, potentially rebuild a body. The book warned sternly of the consequences. A split soul became fragmented forever, unstable, aching, driven by twisted cravings. The very act of creating a Horcrux irreversibly corrupted the caster, chill and madness gradually replacing humanity. There was also a subtle link between Horcrux and main soul, a vulnerability that could be exploited. Regulus felt a chill. This confirmed how dangerous the path Voldemort had taken truly was. Yet another thought sharpened. Soul stability might be the key to touching or even employing dark arts safely. If the soul were resilient and stable, fortified like a strong fortress, then perhaps one could resist the corrosive effects of those spells. The book mentioned a few powerful, iron-willed dark wizards who used dark magic frequently without apparent corruption. He thought of Dumbledore and Grindelwald. At their level, what was dark or light? If they chose to use either, it might make little difference. As for Voldemort, he had split his soul too early and too many times in his hunt for immortality, destroying his own foundation of stability, hence the madness and inhumanity that followed. Regulus skimmed the remaining chapters: soul attachment, possession and the transfer of curses, soul imprisonment and the causes of various spiritual maladies. When he finally closed his mental reach, he felt tonight's harvest had far exceeded expectations. He had not only confirmed the nature and danger of Horcruxes, but also clarified how vital soul stability would be for any foray into the dark arts. Other insights about the soul had opened new lines of thought, and he left the restricted section with his mind racing. 36. Fooling children. Sleep after the Star Trek guided meditation had an excellent effect. It felt like being immersed in a calm, starlit pool, soul-nourished, tension smoothed away. When Regulus woke, his mind was clear, his limbs full of solid strength, and with every breath he felt the magical flow moving more smoothly within him. The progress, perceptible almost by the hour, was intoxicating. He knew this was likely the initial stage of rapid adaptation and growth under the unprecedented stimulation of the Star Trek method. Like parched earth receiving rich rain for the first time, every drop was greedily absorbed. Still, he was sober enough to know it could not last forever. Body and soul have limits. Once initial potential is tapped and the foundations laid, growth will inevitably slow until a stubborn bottleneck appears. To advance beyond that would require some fundamental change or an even more efficient method. For now, though, he would take one step at a time and enjoy the early gains. On Wednesday afternoon, just after Charms, Regulus was gathering his books to go to the library when Avery Cuthbert called to him. Regulus, Avery's voice lacked its usual casual arrogance. "Can we talk in the Slytherin dormitory? It's about something." Regulus glanced over and nodded. "All right." Back in the Slytherin dormitory, Alex and Hermes were absent. Avery shut the door, and a seriousness unfamiliar on his face settled there, mixed with a clumsy, youthful awkwardness. He cleared his throat. "My father wrote to me last night." Regulus listened without interrupting, already guessing the gist. Avery hesitated for a long moment, organizing his thoughts, then blurted out as if deciding he could hold it no longer. He said the mood at the ministry has been shifting. Lots of old families are readjusting their strategies. He heard about what you did at Hogwarts, about your, exchange with fifth-year Travers. He thinks that with an heir like you in the Black family, they might play a bigger role in the changes to come. He hopes I'll keep a good relationship with you. The words sounded stiff, but the meaning was plain. The Cuthberts were another old pureblood family. Their current family head held an important position at the ministry, and they were alert to any sign of power or potential. News of Regulus's abilities had trickled through channels and drawn attention from calculating, forward-looking families. They were reassessing the Black family's value and trying to secure ties through the next generation. Regulus replied non-committally. When Avery finished, he watched Regulus with something like nervousness. Avery was already convinced of Regulus's strength. His father's letter simply gave him a proper excuse to approach. An 11-year-old didn't really understand political investments or family alliances. His thinking was simpler and more direct. Regulus was strong. Following him was a safe, even honorable choice. Regulus read the mix of family duty, personal belief, and youthful pride in Avery's face and understood. Even with elite pureblood schooling, an 11-year-old was still a child. He considered for a moment, then spoke slowly. "Avery, we live in the same dorm, attend the same classes. We're already companions. You want to keep a good relationship with me, that's fine." He shifted into a more serious tone. "But there are a few things I want to make clear." Avery straightened as if entering an important negotiation. Perhaps it was because Regulus's bearing often looked older than his years. The boy reacted accordingly. "First, strength is fundamental. Our family's name gives us a starting point, but real pride should be built on the strength we have ourselves, not just a surname." Avery agreed eagerly. He wanted to prove himself, to stand out beyond his family's name. His eyes shone as he looked at Regulus. "Second, learn to observe and think. Slytherin doesn't lack clever people, but cleverness is often misapplied. Look further ahead." The words were pointed. Avery didn't fully grasp their depth, but he nodded earnestly. "Third," Regulus continued, fixing Avery's gaze, "keep the most basic bottom line, at least in front of me." Avery nodded without hesitation. "I understand. I will." Regulus spoke to him as a partner, not as someone ordering a follower. That made Avery feel better. Who wouldn't like to be treated like an equal? He visibly relaxed and, lowering his voice, nodded toward Hermes's curtained bed. "Regulus, don't you think Mulciber is a bit strange? He disappears at night, and when he comes back, he smells weird. In the duel last week, he even used that." Regulus followed his look to the dark curtains and answered calmly. "Avery, everyone has secrets. It's basic to give people a degree of privacy and respect, unless they reveal something themselves or start doing real harm." Then he changed the subject slightly. "That said, it's reasonable to keep an eye on him. His behavior is odd and could involve some uncommon magical practices or even curses. He may have his own aims at Hogwarts. We don't need to pry, but we should watch in a limited way to avoid getting dragged into trouble." Avery nodded, thoughtful. But Regulus's words had made him wonder. Was Hermes more than a gloomy dark arts enthusiast? For Regulus, the thought went further. Hermes Mulciber, brooding, dangerous, possessing unusual dark arts knowledge and clear goals, would be wasted if treated merely as a roommate to keep at arm's length. He could become a useful agent if controlled, or at least someone to have a stable relationship of mutual interest or deterrence. Initial deterrence likely existed, now interests needed to be found. Avery could be brought into line through demonstrations of knowledge and power. Hermes would require a more direct exchange, strength and clear incentives. In a shared dorm, privacy was fragile under real power. Regulus didn't want to pry into every corner of Hermes's life, but he needed to understand Hermes's limits and needs so he could extend an offer of cooperation when the time was right. The conversation drifted, inevitably, to Alex Rosier. Avery sneered. Rosier's too soft, cowardly, mediocre talent. In our dorm, he doesn't really fit. His disdain was obvious. Even after Regulus's earlier advice, Avery's arrogant instincts made him scorn Alex, who came from a marginal branch of the pure-blood Rosier family and had a gentle, slow personality. Regulus understood how a boy like Avery thought. Blunt lecturing would only provoke him. Avery, Regulus tried a different tack. If you had to accomplish something big, upholding family honor or achieving a goal that needs many people, which would be better, more people helping or fewer? Avery blinked. More, of course. Everyone has strengths and weaknesses, Regulus continued. Alex may not be brilliant at dueling, but he's meticulous and patient. His potions and herbology notes are always the most complete, and his grasp of basics is solid. Plus, he's a Rosier. Even if it's just a branch, that's still a connection, a posture, and power. Avery's thoughtful look deepened. Power comes in many forms, Regulus went on. Pure combat ability is one, but careful logistics, reliable information, or someone who simply won't oppose you are also powerful. To push away someone who could become useful because of prejudice is short-sighted. Regulus was showing Avery a level of pragmatism that an 11-year-old hadn't expected. Avery didn't fully understand all the subtleties, but he had to admit Regulus made sense. 37. Diamonds and graphite. On Friday in Transfiguration class, Professor McGonagall taught them how to turn beetles into buttons. It was a step up from turning matches into needles. Dealing with a living creature and making it an inanimate object required far greater precision of intent and clarity of spell work. Most students fumbled. Beetles writhed, and the room was full of faint buzzing and the little poofs of failure. Regulus picked up a beetle, raised his wand, and murmured the incantation. The insect stiffened in his palm, the sheen on its carapace shifting from dark brown to a smooth black as its body contracted and flattened. In 3 seconds, an exquisite button lay in his hand, black, perfectly smooth, with fine spiral patterns and even a trace of the beetle's original texture that made it oddly beautiful. The transformation had been clean and effortless. He no longer asked questions outside the syllabus as he had before. He knew McGonagall watched him closely. There was no benefit in pressing his luck. The professor, making her rounds, paused at his desk, picked up the button, and inspected it. A flicker of satisfaction crossed her stern face. "Mr. Black, a perfect transformation, 5 points to Slytherin," she said, and moved on. After class, as Regulus was packing his things, she called, "Mr. Black, please stay for a moment." When the other students had left, she came over, spectacles sliding down her nose, her gaze sharp. "Your talent for transfiguration is exceptional, far beyond most students your age. Thank you, Professor. I've noticed that you've been asking fewer questions lately." Her voice was steady, unreadable. Regulus felt a small stir of surprise. He had hoped keeping quiet would be enough to avoid further scrutiny. He answered plainly, "Yes, Professor." "I've reflected on your previous guidance," he added candidly, "and I think at this stage I should concentrate on building a solid foundation and mastering the course material, rather than delving into complex issues beyond my current level." McGonagall studied him for a moment, as if weighing the truth of his words. She inclined her head. "A solid foundation is vital. However, if you have well-considered questions grounded in our coursework, my office door remains open. Hogwarts encourages thinking, but thought must be supported by a sufficient reserve of knowledge." "I understand, Professor. Thank you." Regulus bowed and left, already turning the conversation over in his mind. McGonagall had explicitly welcomed thoughtful questions. He no longer needed to be more guarded than necessary. That afternoon, after herbology, he went to the Transfiguration professor's office. He knocked, was invited in, and found McGonagall at her desk grading homework. Her sternness softened a little when she saw him, and she gestured for him to sit. "Mr. Black, do you have a question?" "Yes, Professor," he said. He took 2 items wrapped in soft cloth from his bag and laid them on her desk. A piece of graphite, soft dark gray, leaving a mark on paper, and a small, perfectly cut diamond that threw brilliant light. "I'd like to ask about these 2 substances." He spoke with quiet concentration. From one perspective, graphite and diamond have an extremely close connection at a fundamental level, even originating from the same basic element. Their appearance, hardness, luster, and value are worlds apart, but to a transfiguration master is there some inherent similarity or the possibility of converting one into the other? "I've tried using transfiguration to explore their connection," he went on. "Attempting to turn graphite into diamond or diamond into graphite is difficult, consumes a great deal of energy, and is hard to maintain. It seems to be more than changing shape and texture. It concerns the stability of the internal structure of the matter." Regulus knew the physical explanation, the arrangement of atoms, and the orientation of bonds, but he could not have explained it to McGonagall in scientific terms. He wanted to know how a transfiguration teacher perceived the matter. Were they seen as linked, and how might one be transmuted into the other? The question reached beyond the textbook into the edges of advanced transfiguration and alchemy. McGonagall's eyes brightened behind her spectacles. She regarded him with something like surprise and admiration. "A very profound and unusual question, Mr. Black. Graphite and diamond. Few students, especially at your age, would consider transfiguration in terms of the fundamental connections of matter. Usually we learn to turn matches into needles or beetles into buttons, focusing on form and function rather than tracing common origins." She picked up the graphite, feeling its greasy texture between her fingers, then examined the diamond and fell briefly into thought. "In my experience," she said slowly, "different substances have different magical manifestations. Turning a feather into a piece of iron is far harder than turning iron into a feather, because the former demands constructing a tighter, more stable structure. The 2 you've brought are indeed starkly contrasted, yet you've noticed their potential common origin. That is very interesting. I have never specifically studied the transfigurative relationship between them," she continued, "but in terms of magical perception, a diamond feels far harder, more condensed and orderly. Graphite feels loose, layered, and prone to sliding. To change graphite into a diamond is more than increasing hardness or altering luster. It is like taking a pile of loose, sliding sheets and rebuilding them into a crystal palace where every part locks together. The difficulty lies in rewriting that internal architecture. It surpasses ordinary transformations of form." Regulus nodded. "Exactly. When I tried, it felt like they shared some basic substance, but the way that substance was arranged was completely different. Transfiguration must be about more than appearance. It's about reconstructing that underlying structure, forcing it from one stable state into another equally, or more, stable state." McGonagall listened with unreserved attention. His words had given her a new way to think about the problem, by the internal rules or construction patterns of matter. At last, she allowed a faint smile. "Exquisite insight, Mr. Black. It calls to mind certain high-level alchemical workings about the essential transformation of matter. Indeed, the sort of thought that lies behind legends like the Philosopher's Stone." She waved her wand and the graphite floated up. "Let us test this idea." She did not mutter a long incantation. She tapped the graphite lightly with her wand tip and focused, pouring a clean, densely condensed strand of magic into it, magic with the unmistakable will to reconstruct internal connections. The graphite changed before Regulus's eyes. The dark gray surface lightened, the texture tightened, clarity increased. The piece became visibly denser and began to refract light. Seconds later, a transparent crystal with the hardness and gleam of diamond lay on the desk. With another tiny tap, edges were subtly polished by an unseen force until it flashed with searing brilliance, until a small, perfect diamond sat where graphite had been. The transformation was effortless and stable in a way Regulus had never managed. That was the work of a master. As you can see, Professor McGonagall said, when one's understanding of a substance's internal structural rules is sufficiently deep, when magical power is strong enough, and when the will is clear, this kind of transformation can be achieved. But as you said, it is far more difficult than ordinary transfiguration because it requires the caster not only to envision the target form, but also to understand and reconstruct its internal, stable structure, turning loose, layered connections into a sturdy three-dimensional whole. Regulus asked at the right moment, "Professor, what about the Philosopher's Stone?" She put away her wand and looked at him. As for the Philosopher's Stone, that is the pinnacle of alchemy beyond ordinary transfiguration. It touches on creation and eternity. The gold produced by ordinary transfiguration often bears a strong imprint of the caster's magical will. It is unstable, may revert to its original state over time or under powerful interference, or possess a certain false quality. The gold transmuted by the Philosopher's Stone is said to possess truly eternal material properties. The difference may lie in whether the perfect internal structural rules of gold have truly been created or fixed. The discussion clarified much for Regulus. McGonagall's viewpoint was more intuitive about magical imprint and will. His own approach carried a modern scientific mindset. The convergence of the two brought a sudden clarity to his understanding of transfiguration. "Your talent and depth of thought in transfiguration are impressive, Mr. Black," she said. McGonagall's tone softened. She stood, went to an old bookshelf, and took down a thick, well-worn notebook. Regulus noticed the cover was made of deep blue dragonhide. The book looked cherished. "These are some insights, conjectures, and lessons from my youth while exploring higher levels of transfiguration," she said, handing it to him with a solemn expression. "It contains no specific spells or shortcuts, more reflections on the nature of transfiguration and how to perceive the object you wish to transfigure more clearly. I think it might help your current explorations." Regulus received the notebook with both hands. He could feel the faint echo of magic on the cover and the accumulated wisdom of decades in the careful handwriting. The gift was immeasurably valuable. "Thank you very much, Professor McGonagall," he said earnestly. "I hope it guides me in the right direction." McGonagall looked at him with weighty eyes. Transfiguration is one of the most direct ways magical will alters reality. A powerful will can reshape matter, but the will itself must be guided by wisdom and morality. Never forget that we study magic to understand the world, not merely to dominate or distort it. "Yes, Professor, I won't forget." Regulus nodded. He understood the warning. He thanked her again and left the office. After the door closed, McGonagall stood where she was for a long moment, staring at the closed door with a complex expression. In all her years of teaching, such a combination of talent and thought was rare: calm, sharp, creative, and outwardly restrained and respectful. That combination made her more worried. If such gifts turned to the wrong path, the harm could be immense. "I can only hope he chooses the right path," she murmured. She tried to return to marking papers, but could not focus. Finally, she rose and went to the headmaster's office on the 8th floor of the castle. She spoke the password. The stone gargoyle moved aside, the spiral staircase turned upward, and she knocked on the gleaming oak door. "Come in, Minerva," came Dumbledore's gentle voice. McGonagall entered. The circular office hummed with the gentle whir of peculiar silver instruments. Portraits of past headmasters pretended to doze but were listening. Fawkes preened on his perch. "Albus, I need to talk to you about Regulus Black," she began without preamble. Dumbledore peered over his half-moon spectacles, his blue eyes twinkling. "Ah, young Mr. Black. I suppose he's posed another transfiguration question that even my deputy headmistress finds challenging?" "It's not just a question," McGonagall said, sitting in her usual hardback chair. "His talent is extraordinary. His understanding of transfiguration surpasses his years and touches on areas I don't often explore. More importantly, his way of thinking is very particular, structurally clear, and his perspective is lofty. It's unusual, Albus." She recounted the earlier discussion about transmutation, the Philosopher's Stone, and the internal structural rules of matter. Dumbledore listened quietly, hands folded. "And," she added, frowning, I've noticed some of his behaviors. He no longer asks those overly advanced questions in class. He acts like a student focused on building a solid foundation. But I had a house elf keep an eye on him and discovered he often practices sophisticated magic alone in secluded parts of the castle. Nonverbal spells and highly precise transfiguration. That's far beyond what someone his age should master. Some of his magic is even stronger than what many adults can perform. He has academic exchanges with Lily Evans in the library. He's even taught her muggle methods of essay writing. With his classmates, he keeps a distance, but there is a boy named Avery Cuthbert who seems to have begun following him. Regulus's response looks like conditional acceptance and guidance, not mere exploitation. Dumbledore nodded. Yes, Minerva, I have noticed these things as well. You knew? McGonagall asked. Of course. Dumbledore smiled, his gaze sweeping the quiet portraits. This castle is full of eyes and ears. I have taken particular notice of young Mr. Black. From the moment he was sorted, the sorting hat gave me some interesting information. It said he looks at the stars with a vision beyond worldly strife, yet he chose Slytherin. He paused, measured. He is not like his brother Sirius. Sirius's rebellion is fire, bright, direct. Regulus is calm on the surface, but his interior may hold complex thoughts and unknown ideas. His thirst for knowledge is sincere, his pursuit of power clear, but he seems to have his own standards and logic. That's exactly what worries me, McGonagall said. He has talent, ideas, knows how to conceal and calculate, if he is drawn to darker ideologies. We cannot choose the path for our students, Minerva, Dumbledore said gently but firmly. We can provide knowledge, set examples, and offer guidance and correction when necessary. As of now, Regulus Black has not crossed the line. His interactions with Lily are based on mutual respect. His way of restraining Avery resembles guidance rather than indulgence. His exploration of transfiguration, while deep, has not touched forbidden, dangerous areas. He looked out at the darkening sky. The shadow of Lord Voldemort is lengthening. Many ancient families are making choices. The House of Black will not remain aloof. Regulus is tied to it. Each choice he makes will affect him and may affect many others. We cannot foresee the future, but we can observe and we can prepare. Do you think he will be different? McGonagall asked. Dumbledore was silent for a moment, then replied slowly. The stars the Sorting Hat saw may be a metaphor. They could mean ambition, or they could mean a broader vision. His way of viewing magic is different from many. That may be dangerous, or it may be an opportunity. Time will tell, Minerva. Until then, our duty remains the same. Teach him, watch him, and when necessary, ensure he harms neither others nor himself. The conversation ended. McGonagall's worry did not vanish, but the headmaster's words brought some small reassurance. At least, she thought, Dumbledore was watching the boy too. 39. I have unique insights into transfiguration. Back in the dormitory, sitting at his desk, Regulus gently stroked the cover of Professor McGonagall's deep blue dragonhide notebook. He skimmed a few pages. Just as the note had said, there were no specific spells inside. Instead, it was full of profound reflections on the nature of transfiguration. One passage on the difficulty gradient of transfiguring different materials caught his attention. Professor McGonagall argued that difficulty wasn't determined only by an object's apparent complexity. It was intrinsically tied to the stability of a material's internal structure and the strength of its morphological memory. Combining that with his own practice, Regulus had essentially confirmed the point in his head. Transforming an element into a different form was far harder than converting one complex compound into another, especially when the change required altering the material's fundamental properties. Turning a wooden stick into an iron bar meant replacing one established structure, organic polymer chains and cellular architecture, with another, metallic crystal lattices. Many young transfigurers could manage transformations like that, though most could only alter shape. But turning graphite into diamond was different. It was changing one allotrope of carbon into another without changing the element itself. That required completely restructuring internal bonds, rearranging the molecular lattice to produce two substances with drastically different physical properties. This demanded an understanding and manipulation at the microscopic, even near atomic level, a difficulty far beyond ordinary shape-shifting. He took out a small shard of graphite he always carried and began to practice. Using his magical perception, he probed into the stone's interior, trying to pry apart its layered stacks to introduce local distortions and cross-links that would produce a tiny patch of material with increased hardness and a different sheen. It was fiendishly difficult. Graphite's loose, slipping layers had a tendency to slide as a whole whenever magic interfered. Rather than allowing a controlled local rearrangement, the layers tended to shear, destroying the integrity of the sample and reducing it to a pile of flaky carbon if he wasn't infinitely careful. He had to employ incredibly precise magical control, like the most delicate engraving tool, carving and welding at a molecular scale. The work gave him a deeper understanding of carbon allotropes and of applied magic. Wizards might not have built a scientific system of experiments and mathematics like Muggles had to describe the microscopic world, but they were by no means inferior. Professor McGonagall, from a few seconds' observation, could judge the intrinsic differences between graphite and diamond. That intuitive perception of a substance's essence was something Muggle technology still struggled to achieve. Regulus's advantage was simply that his previous life had given him a foundation in the sciences, and crossing over had sharpened his magical perception. Still, the skill McGonagall showed was the product of decades devoted to transfiguration. That realization also clarified his path forward. Mastery required more than changing form. It required knowing principles deeply enough to alter a thing's very essence. Legendary alchemy, and the Philosopher's Stone in particular, must touch an even more terrifying domain, not merely reorganizing molecules, but reconstructing atoms at a more fundamental level. Turning lead into gold would mean changing the number of protons in a nucleus, or at least perfectly simulating every chemical bond and macroscopic property of a gold atom. That lay well beyond ordinary transfiguration, and the promise of prolonging life or containing vast magic power explained why even Voldemort had sought such means. During a break in practice, Regulus's thoughts wandered. The air was a mixture of elements and compounds, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, water vapor, noble gases, but the spells most wizards used, whether protective charms, offensive hexes, or everyday enchantments, did not specifically filter or defend against subtle changes in those invisible components. It wasn't that it couldn't be done. It wasn't technically difficult, but it was almost universally overlooked. Take oxygen, for example. What if the oxygen around a person's face could be instantaneously transfigured into an oxygen-based compound the body couldn't use? Ozone, say. Or, conversely, if hazardous particles could be transfigured into oxygen to be inhaled and then revert after gas exchange inside the body. Fiberglass, asbestos, even radioactive substances, anything could be weaponized in that way. The key would be high-precision identification and instantaneous transformation of specific elements. For now it was theoretical, but the direction felt right. As he lost himself in microscopic restructuring and dangerous thought experiments, the dormitory door opened and Avery Cuthbert returned. He paused when he saw Regulus at the desk, a small, twisted object with an odd sheen floating before him and a faint, focused light streaming from the tip of his wand. Regulus was clearly practicing transfiguration. The "hey" on Avery's lips died. Now that he considered himself on the same side as Regulus, he knew better than to interrupt. He tiptoed to his bed and put down his books. Soon Alex Rosier came in, carrying a stack of books and looking relaxed after finishing his homework. He almost greeted Regulus, but Avery raised a finger to his lips, glared, and jerked his chin in Regulus's direction. Startled, Alex covered his mouth, saw Regulus's concentration, and fell silent, moving carefully to his own bed. He felt quietly pleased. Avery still had his haughty manner, but he'd chosen a single gesture instead of blasting someone with a Petrificus Totalis or Stupefy. The atmosphere in the dormitory felt different from before. Once it had been Avery's authoritarian chest-thumping, Hermes's brooding inscrutability, Regulus's cold silence, and Alex's own timidity. Now the hierarchy remained, but Avery no longer bullied at will, and Regulus, powerful though he was, did not lord it over others. Alex suspected much of the change was Regulus's doing. Thinking of the letters from home, his parents' usual admonitions to study hard, stay healthy, keep to himself, and stay safe, he felt a flush of gratitude toward Regulus. On the margins of Slytherin's inner circle, Regulus had, almost without meaning to, made the air more breathable. Regulus noticed his roommate's return, but didn't let it distract him. His thoughts raced, magic threading out in controlled filaments as he maintained delicate influence over the graphite's internal bonds. He had found a path to transfiguration by molecular rearrangement. Professor McGonagall's demonstration and the notebook had pointed the way, but practice was slow, painstaking work. The last to come back was Hermes Mulciber. He shoved the door open, and a chill followed him in. His eyes took in Regulus at work, Avery's restraining gesture, and Alex's cautiousness. A nearly imperceptible, scornful smile brushed Hermes's mouth. He looked down on Avery's show of submission. Though he had lost to Regulus in the leadership duel and been shaken by how easily the other had neutralized his immature bone-blood separation technique, Hermes still had a deep confidence in himself. He believed he still had unseen trump cards, the real power. Many of his family's darker methods were inconvenient to display at school, but in an unconstrained life-or-death duel beyond the castle's rules, he was certain those arts might give him a chance to kill Regulus. Several family-inherited or secretly acquired dark arts flashed through his mind. Shadowbind Devourer summons shadowy tentacles from dark creatures that bind an enemy while continuously draining their life force and magical power. The bound feel a bone-deep cold and soul-sapping weakness. Pain Echo, a curse that, when it strikes, amplifies and prolongs all suffering the target subsequently endures. Physical damage, fear, psychological trauma, echoing through the body until it causes mental collapse, loss of control, and sometimes suicide or complete madness from the accumulated agony. Withering Breath, a malicious curse that doesn't kill instantly, but causes flesh, blood, and magic at the point of contact to rot away like a poisoned plant. It is extremely difficult to cure, the process long and agonizing, and it gives off an aura that decays nearby vegetation. This was the kind of power Hermes thought worth pursuing: swift, lethal, painful, intimidating, capable of making enemies fear from the very depths of their souls. 40. Transfiguration, buddy. Hermes glanced at the odd little object in Regulus's hand with a dismissive curl of his lip. He could concede the importance of fundamentals, and even admit that Regulus's basics were frighteningly solid, but he was stubborn. In real combat, victory came from powerful spells that could decide life and death in an instant. The tricks taught in Transfiguration and Charms were, to him, nothing more than flashy juggling in the face of the dark arts. He couldn't see the point of Regulus's practice now, nor could he grasp the terrifying potential of that microscopic reconstruction of a substance's essence. To Hermes, it looked like making a stone harder or shinier. What practical use was that? In a duel, were you going to pick up a hardened stone and hit someone with it? Ridiculous. He ignored Avery's warning glance to be quiet and deliberately made his footsteps heavier as he walked across the dormitory. He dropped an old, blank-covered book onto the nightstand with a dull thud that sounded too loud in the quiet room. The noise finally pulled Regulus out of his concentration. He let the magic around the stone dissipate. The stone returned to its ordinary form and fell onto the desk. Regulus lifted his head, his gray eyes calm as they fixed on Hermes, the source of the disturbance. Something the matter? His voice betrayed no emotion. Hermes leaned against his bedpost, face wearing its usual gloom with a faint provocation. Nothing. Just thinking it's a shame some people waste their time on flashy tricks with no substance. Real power doesn't come from molding stones into different shapes. The barbs were aimed. Avery frowned. Alex lowered his head, suddenly nervous. Regulus regarded Hermes slowly. Your idea of power is too narrow and too extreme. You only see the surface, destruction and pain, and fail to appreciate the strength in the basic rules that make this world what it is. As for knowledge, he shook his head. You probably don't know that the wizard most people call the most powerful in the magical world today, Albus Dumbledore, is a transfiguration master at the height of his art. Hermes's expression tightened. He knew Dumbledore's name, of course, but as a kid infatuated with the dark arts, he'd never bothered to look into what Dumbledore actually excelled at. Regulus stood up. His wand was already in his hand before he finished the sentence. He needed a subject to test an idea that had just occurred to him, and Hermes's attitude made him perfect bait. You seem to underestimate my magic, Regulus said. Coincidentally, I think your magic isn't much to speak of either. He didn't finish before his wand was raised, pointed at Hermes. Hermes went instantly alert and reached for his wand to defend or counterattack. But Regulus was faster, or perhaps his magic worked in an unconventional way. There was no flash, no sound, nothing to announce the spell. Suddenly, Hermes felt his breathing stop, as if a hand had clamped over his lungs. The air he inhaled, the instant it entered his nose and mouth, seemed to lose all its breathability. It was as if he'd inhaled cotton, utterly useless, unable to sustain any lung function, unable to provide the faintest hint of oxygen. His eyes widened, mouth open, and he tried to breathe harder. His chest rose and fell, but felt meaningless, a panic building deeper with each useless gasp. He tried to shout for explanation, to raise his wand, but his voice wouldn't come, and his limbs grew heavy as his brain went foggy from lack of oxygen. He couldn't form the focus for nonverbal spells. He stared at Regulus in panic. Regulus stood there with his wand calm in his hand, his gaze not even fixed on Hermes as if looking at nothing living. What he had done was an extension of the thought that had been occupying him earlier. He hadn't attempted a complex elemental transformation. At his level, that would have been too slow. Instead, he had done something simpler and harsher. He defined. Using non-directional transfiguration, he intervened at the level of the environment's omnipresent substance. He cast a single spell and allowed his magic to do the rest, forcibly redefining the composition of the gases in the room into something unbreathable. It was cleaner, faster, and at his current stage more reliable than trying to transfigure oxygen into a specific toxin. He had no intention of killing. Avery watched with shining eyes. He didn't understand the mechanics, wasn't even sure whether it qualified as dark arts, but that only made Regulus seem more formidable. Not understanding made it look more advanced. Alex had gone pale, hands clapped over his mouth to stifle a cry. He had thought the dormitory was calming down, and now this wasn't a mere argument between classmates. This was a rehearsal for murder. Hermes' face shifted from red to a bluish pallor, his eyes bulging, body twitching as he clawed at his chest. The idea of death pressed on him like a cold hand. He couldn't breathe, couldn't cast spells. Producing even a scrap of magic amid the suffocating terror was impossible. He felt he was going to die. The method was silent, invisible, and stranger than any dark arts he knew. The unknown made it worse. There was no malignant aura, no icy sting of a curse, just a terrifyingly efficient principle that stripped away a basic condition of life. He had been utterly defeated without even comprehending the means. Seconds stretched. After about 30 heartbeats, Hermes' struggling weakened, his eyes glazed. Even Avery, who loved power, broke into a cold sweat. Killing someone at school, even a Mulciber, would mean ruin, a level of trouble that could not be shrugged off. He started to open his mouth, to beg Regulus to stop, but froze when he looked at Regulus's absolutely composed, rational eyes. Someone so coldly calculating wouldn't slaughter a schoolmate over a quarrel. He swallowed the plea. Just as Hermes was about to black out, Regulus flicked his wrist and relaxed the magic. Hermes lurched forward, collapsing onto his hands and knees, lungs working like bellows. He coughed violently, tears and snot streaming, gasping for a full minute before he could look up with bloodshot, disbelieving eyes. Regulus had already sheathed his wand and watched him with flat curiosity. "Now," he asked evenly, "what do you think of transfiguration?" He offered no explanation, left Hermes to guess, fear, and puzzle over the source of the invisible, intangible, deadly change. Hermes lay sprawled on the floor, trembling from the aftermath. His thoughts were a mess. Transfiguration could make him unable to breathe. It smashed his entire understanding of the subject. But if it wasn't transfiguration, then what was it? There had been no dark aura, no chill of a curse. The unknown only deepened his fear. He realized he couldn't read Regulus Black at all. Not only was the other's foundational skill overwhelming, he wielded methods that defied categorization, methods that could not easily be defended against. Avery exhaled, half relieved and half ecstatic, pride swelling. "See," he thought, "this is who I chose to follow. Powerful, precise, and unfathomable." He began thinking how to counter such a move. Bubblehead charm in advance? Permanent protection? Too passive. Alex exhaled shakily, legs weak as he watched Hermes recover and Regulus remain calm. He decided then to be even more careful with his words and actions, never provoke Regulus. Regulus, however, paid no attention to his roommate's reactions. He returned to his desk and sat, his mind already moving. The practice had confirmed a hypothesis. Tampering with the omnipresent fundamental substances of the environment was a blind spot for many wizards and a promising avenue for attack. But what if he went a step further?